All right, welcome to TYT Interviews. We're going to have what I hope is one of the most interesting interviews we've ever done. It's with Sam Harris. He has a BA in philosophy from Stanford, a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA. You might be familiar with some of his books: The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and Future of Reason, Letter to a Christian Nation, The Moral Landscape, Lying Free Will, and now his most recent book, Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. Now, Sam, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you, Cenk.
I really appreciate you coming in. It's going to be an interesting conversation, as I said, for a number of reasons. There are a lot of things that we agree on. I would say at least 90% of our views are probably similar, if not identical. And I think some people might be surprised by that. And there's some that we disagree on. And actually, the more that I've read your stuff, the more I realized the degree of our differences. Right. So that'll be interesting to talk about. And we want to air out everything. You asked our audience, hey, send in questions. We have to be honest with you guys. You see all these papers in front of me. We stopped reading after 75 pages of questions. Right. Okay, so there was a lot of questions for you, Sam. So let's start with the easy stuff, the stuff that we agree with on, okay? So obviously you've written a lot about religion. You're a well-known atheist, although you don't love that word for reasons that you've explained. And on the topic of religion, I think we totally agree. You're against religion, I'm against religion, I'm against all the religions, you're against all the religions?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
All right, great.
But I think I know there are things we disagree about in that area, but yes, we are both atheists by any reasonable definition.
Right. And having read some of your new book, actually, there was refreshing agreement there as well, okay? So I love that you're pointing out that spirituality and religion don't have to be connected. I've been tearing my hair out saying this for so long. Yeah. I don't have to subscribe to one of the religions to be a spiritual person, right? And just because somebody is spiritual, and I'm not that spiritual, but I think I'm open to it, and I have no problems with other people being spiritual. And just because somebody's open to spirituality doesn't mean that they believe in voodoo or subscribe to any particular religion. So I think you talk about that in an interesting way in the new book.
Right.
So now the parts that I think we disagree on is Islam and perception of Muslims. Okay, so broadly speaking. So let's start that conversation.
Can we actually start just with the context for this conversation? Because I'm very happy to be talking to you, and I think we will have a good conversation. But I'm not at all happy with how we arrived here together, and I think there's something to be said about that, because viewers coming naively to this video won't understand, the context for this conversation. I think, and it's not a surprise to you because we've communicated by email, but I think you've treated me really unfairly in the last few weeks, and I've come here to clean up this mess, and that the structure of that conversation is an unfortunate one, because I'm going to be saying a lot of things that are going to sound defensive, right? I'm taking, the slime of a few people who you've had on your show before me off of me, right? And that's an unfortunate just context for any conversation, because one, I'm going to have to say some critical things about these people. These are people I don't actually want to talk about, like Reza Aslan and this guy C.J. Worrellman, who you've had on your show. It's also just, and we're not going to talk about some of the interesting things we could talk about, like the book on consciousness and meditation and spirituality I just wrote. I mean, I doubt we're going to get to that. So there's an opportunity cost here imposed by the fact that there's a huge mess to clean up, and people should understand that that's the context. Right.
So that is your perception of it, and hence we have our first disagreement. I don't agree with that. Okay, so I think that the things that they said were, number one, people come on the show and say things that I don't agree with all the time. You will say things tonight that I don't agree with, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have that conversation. Number two, you have a perception of what they said that is not the same as mine, right? Okay. You view it as totally unfair, but that's why we're going to have this conversation, right? Because I think it is fair. So let's talk about it and see where we come out of it.
There's a deeper point about a problem with journalism that I think should be exposed here. Because it's not, because I think you and I have a different view about just how this game should be played. And I'll give you an analogy. So the website Salon has maybe half a dozen or a dozen articles on me that are just pure slander. I mean, they misrepresent my views. one of these articles, one of the writers calls me a douchebag. I mean, this is not journalism. These are just hit pieces that are on the website Salon. Now, any naive reader of that website, they visit this website, it's one of the most trafficked websites on earth. They think, well, this is all journalistically sourced. There's an editorial policy that has made all of this kosher. But the truth is, much of what you read on Salon is just maniacs in their bedrooms typing. I mean, this is not the New York Times. Now,
Salon would ask me to have you take this video off because you said that about them.
No, well, let me tell.
You see what I'm saying?
No, well, no. It's not a valid analogy, but we'll get there. So,
okay.
So when I communicate, this stuff is built up over time, and so I communicate with the editor-in-chief of Salon, complaining about this. One article says I supported the Iraq War. I never supported the Iraq War. So. So factual inaccuracies and tonal things that are just crazy for journalists to be doing. And the editor-in-chief of Salon says, well, I'm so sorry you feel that way, but at Salon we're open to all voices. This is all about conversation. This is a salon after all. So perhaps you would like to write an article for us, defending yourself, showing how you're not a racist and a bigot and an Islamophobe and a Zionist and everything else we've called you. Yeah. So, and I said, okay, so great. So first you steal part of my reputation by just putting all of the stuff out there. Now you want to steal some of my time by getting me to work for you for free, right? And then you want me to drive all my traffic to your site, all my readers, so they can read where I have said, I'm not a racist and I'm not a genocidal maniac. Now, does this sound familiar? Because this is the situation I feel like I'm in with you. And again, I'm not begrudging the conversation, because I think you and I will have a good conversation. But what has happened on your show in previous weeks, you've had this guy Whirlman, who's now, a well-established fraud and liar, and he's outed as a serial plagiarist.
First of all, let's just be clear, though. The plagiarism charges came out after he was on the show.
Yes, it's true. It's true. But it was obvious to me that this guy was lying about my views, and he's on your show unrebutted for whatever, an hour.
Sam, you're here to rebut him. So let me answer some of those charges.
But so let me just ask you one more question, and then you can answer.
Right.
What journalistic purpose is being served by having that hour of video online until the end of the world, where he calls me a genocidal maniac? He says I want to execute a nuclear first strike against the Muslim world. I want to kill people for thought crimes. What journalistic purpose is being served when that video stands on its own? They're not going to necessarily find this video in association with that. That's just going to be out there forever, and this guy has no credibility. So why keep the video up?
So, Sam, you think that everybody's being unfair to you, so whenever you guys have a disagreement, you view them as being defamatory and malicious, etc.
Yeah.
But Sam,
not everyone,
you say
in this case.
Now, you say incredibly outrageous things, like we should consider a nuclear first strike, right? We should consider torture. We should consider bombing things. So let's go one at a time, right? You say all these things.
We'll get into the details.
Right, and we are going to get into the details, right? And then you put caveats in there, right? Which is smart. You put caveats, but you say we should consider all these things. And then when people criticize that, you go, how could you? Well, but of course they're going to, Sam, even if you're right, they're going to criticize. Do you see what I'm saying? You have to expect that.
Criticism is totally fair, and hard-hitting criticism is totally fair. I publish very hard-hitting criticism of other writers and other scientists and public figures. So I mean, the stuff I've written about Francis Collins, head of the NIH, is incredibly hard-hitting. There's no way he likes what I've written about him. But I was careful not to misrepresent his views. And if anyone ever catches me misrepresenting the views of one of my targets, I will be the first to apologize. That is a completely illegitimate way to argue. And now I can show you, so we're going to get into the details, I can show you how I'm being misrepresented by people like Reza Aslan and C.J. Whirlman. And when I argue against Reza in this conversation, I will be very careful not to misrepresent his views. I don't have to distort his views to show you what's wrong with them. And he has never honestly dealt with one of my views. Just to give you one example, in his interview with you, he said, I get all my views about religion from watching television. Right? This is a line sometimes he says, from watching Fox News. This is what happens when you know nothing about religion and you just get all your views from Fox News, right? Now, anyone who has actually read The End of Faith, my first book, knows that that's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just, this is an ad hominem attack that is not actually engaging my argument. And he's never engaged my specific arguments. And we'll get into the details, but I want to press you, and this is an incredibly boring part of the conversation. I don't want to stay here long, but it just seems to me that you have a responsibility for stewarding journalism into its digital future. And what Salon is doing is the end of journalism, as far as I can see. I mean, that is where journalism is going to die, where you see absolutely no burden to represent people accurately.
But Sam, can't you see that Salon would then say that you're doing the same exact thing that you're charging them of? They would say, hey Sam, you're not seeing the entire body of our work. You didn't see it. You didn't see the nuances. You didn't see the other articles.
No, I see what's said about me.
So then you say that we're the end of journalism and we do defamation. We do all these different things that you've charged us. Well, that's not fair. And then they would come to me and you say, hey, Reza said things that are unfair about me, so that's a questionable video that you've put up because my guest said something unfair about you. And then Salon would say, your guest, Sam Harris, said terrible things about us. You should take that video down. I'm not taking any of them down. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't correct from time to time, Sam. So, for example, in one of our videos when we were discussing what you said, I slipped up and I said that you said it was a vast majority of Muslims, when you never said that. You said vast numbers of Muslims in the context of a discussion. So we went back and put an annotation on that to clarify it, right? To say that's not what Sam said.
Let's get into the details, because this is not going anywhere.
Right. So I'm saying that we are being as responsible as we possibly can in airing out other people's views. Here, this is not a TV conversation. You're not going to get cut off. Your mic's not going to get off. We're going to go as long as you want, as long as we want, as long as people have an understanding of where we stand. We do the best that we can there, okay? And so just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean they're wrong. So now, back to the original point. So obviously, based on all your books, Christianity is wrong, Judaism is wrong, Islam is wrong, right? Okay, I agree, they're all wrong. Okay, now the question comes as to whether you mean, and this is probably the most common question we got submitted here, whether you mean just Islam or do you mean Muslims, right? Now, so there are dozens of quotes here from you, not referring to just Islam, but to referring to Muslims, okay? So if you want, I can go through them,
No, let's just have the conversation. So
okay,
I can clarify what
right.
I mean here.
So you don't just mean Islam, obviously. You do mean Muslims, right?
Well, so when I talk about Islam, I'm talking about a set of ideas and their logical and behavioral consequences. Now, these ideas wouldn't matter if nobody believed them, right? So in every case, I'm interested in the numbers of people who believe specific ideas to the extent they actually believe them. So there are people who sort of believe what they say they believe. There are people who don't believe it at all. There are people who don't read the books. There are people who would bet their lives on the truth of every word. There's a whole range of cognitive commitment to certain doctrines. So when I talk about Islam, I'm talking about a set of doctrines. I'm talking about the Quran and the Hadith and the example of the Prophet Muhammad as evidence in the earliest biographies. And this is a set of stories, principles, claims about the nature of reality. And there are 1.6 billion Muslims, and there are, in any given context, even in the context of a single jihadist or a single Islamist mind, there will be different levels of adherence to specific doctrines. So you could get, I'm sure you could get as devout a Muslim as you're going to find anywhere, and you say, you make a list of all of the beliefs, that the sum total of beliefs in the canon, and there's some he's going to be sure of, and there's some he's going to be 50-50 on, right? So so to the degree that any proposition like adulterers should be stoned to death, or apostates should be killed, or women are less valuable than men, or you can get into paradise by dying in defense of the faith, martyrs get 72 virgins, whatever the specific belief is, I am concerned, one, to just criticize the doctrine where it seems like a dangerous doctrine if believed, and then two, I want to have an honest discussion about the prevalence of that belief in the Muslim world. And by Muslim world, I mean the 1.6 billion Muslims wherever they happen to be, right? So the Muslim community here in Los Angeles, the Muslim community in throughout Indonesia. So the Muslim world is just the sum total of Muslims. And if there's a person over there who was Muslim 15 minutes ago, but he no longer is Muslim by the end of the night after hearing our conversation, well then the Muslim world used to be over there, and now it's not over there. So I'm interested in what people believe and how much they believe it, and the link between belief and action.
Right. So if you're talking about the doctrine of Islam, I think that you're not really going to get substantive disagreement from non-believers. Whether it's me, it's Glenn Greenwald, whoever it might be, right?
Well, it's not true. I mean, so we should go into the areas of disagreement because, one, non-believers, for the most part, certainly secular liberals who have never really been especially religious, and don't really know what it's like to believe in God or paradise or any of these things. They believe that all religions are more or less the same. So to single out any religion over any other in any context is already taboo among these people, and it's a sign of some kind of animus towards specific people. And you feel this. I mean, I've seen what you said about my remarks about Mormonism and my remarks about Islam. Mm-hmm. Reza Aslan certainly feels this. He thinks all religions are equally empty. They're equally just a tissue of stories and myths and images, and nothing's inherently violent in one as opposed to inherently peaceful in another. And we should
agree and disagree about that, because that's not exactly what I've said. I'm talking about.
Well, that was the last thing was Reza's view.
No, I know, but when you said that I see no difference between the religions, that's not true. So I think you make a good point about, for example, Islam or Christianity on one side and Jain's on the other side, right? So they are definitely different religions that teach different principles, and I believe that you can make value judgments about those, right? And say, hey, in Jainism, you're talking a more peaceful language, right? And so it is going to direct people in a different direction. That doesn't mean that no Jain can do anything violent or even do a holy war or do a suicide bombing. They can, but I understand that the ideology does not point in that direction.
Yes, and it points in the opposite direction. It would be unthinkable to really justify jihad or suicide bombing by recourse to the doctrine of Jainism. It's just because the central message of Jainism is nonviolence. You have to be a vegetarian. You could not open a slaughterhouse and say, well, this is a Jain slaughterhouse. Right. And so
but
that matters.
Now, I think so. You can make distinctions, so we agree there. Okay. Now, the slight caveat to that, or a very important caveat to that, is that Jainism is fairly unique. Most of the other religions are bathed in blood, and so
to varying degrees, which is important.
Right. So that's point one. Point two. The point that you were alluding to, what I said about Mormons is. There we might have disagreement. So you say Mormons are slightly more absurd than Christians, right? Because you say you take all the absurdity of Christianity and then you add on top of it further absurdity that Jesus is going to come to Missouri, etc. Right. I think those are really good points, but to me, that's the difference between 2 + 2 = 5 or 2 + 2 = 6. Neither one is true, so what difference does it make?
Well, no, this is actually, it's a cute statement, and I think nothing hinges on it, but it's actually a mathematically precise statement. If you think Jesus is going to come back, that's one order of improbability. If you think Jesus is going to come back to Jackson County, Missouri, that actually increases the unlikelihood or decreases the likelihood.
If we're talking about math, it's like dividing by zero.
This
is equally unlikely that he's going to go to Jerusalem or Missouri. He ain't coming.
No.
The whole thing's is Zeus more likely to come to Missouri or to Athens?
It's the specifics that make it less probable. If you just think he's going to come back somewhere, that's one thing. If you think he's going to come back to Jackson County, Missouri, that's less likely. And that is a mathematically true point. This is just probability theory.
Even if I were to grant you that, which I definitely do not grant you, but even if I were to grant you that,
you're going to hear from a bunch of mathematicians who are going to insist that you grant that.
Okay, that's fine, and I look forward to that, and hopefully we'll get 75 pages on that. Sam, what difference does it make? Both of them are totally untrue. Totally untrue. Nobody talked to the Smith. Nobody talked to Jesus of Nazareth. It's made up.
I only made that point in the context of saying that you can say objectively true things about differences among religions, and even say objectively true things about the likelihood that any one is true. Now, there's another thing that cuts against Mormonism, which many people have noticed, which is we just know too much about Joseph Smith to take him entirely seriously. We know he was a con man and a libidinous guy who just kept making up new revelations so that he'd get it on with the wives of his followers. I mean, there's just too much information on him. Now, the history of Islam and Judaism and Christianity is cloaked in much less certainty than that. So it's easy to romanticize who these guys were.
I think this is a small point, Sam, but let me just say on that, I look at it the exact opposite. Okay, so I know Joseph Smith was a charlatan. My favorite story is when he tells his wife, God talked to me and it turns out I need to have sex with our maid.
Right.
And she's like, oh, sure you do, buddy. And she's the first person not to believe in Mormonism in that instance. And Muhammad has very similar stories in Islam, okay? Very conveniently, he also had to have sex with all the women and conquer all the land, etc., right? But Moses didn't even exist. Well, so I would view that as less credible because he didn't even exist.
Yeah, but obviously many people think he did exist. It's just the more you push it into the well of history, it becomes you can just have your beliefs about the matriarchs and patriarchs be unconstrained by counter evidence.
So you're ironically giving them credit because they're so wrong we can't disprove them. It's such a black box.
It's a black box.
Okay, so that's why I say it's a small point of difference.
This is not important.
Right. So now, but either way, Islam is totally wrong. The doctrine is wrong, etc. Now, the question of whether it applies to all Muslims is where we get into the disagreement. And you don't say all Muslims, you're very clear about that, right? And I can give you quotes on that as well, so the audience is clear. Sam never says all 1.6 billion Muslims, and you don't even say majority, okay?
Well, but the irony here is that, so I've heard some of the things you've said, so let me just pull this in here, that I seem to be painting, and many people have said this since the Bill Maher interview, I seem to be painting all Muslims with a broad brush, even though I don't say all Muslims. In talking about Islam, I'm basically disparaging all Muslims. And I'm generalizing unfairly based on poll results to the rest of the Muslim world. But the whole point of thinking about poll results is to generalize specifically to those percentages that answered the question one way or the other. So if you want to, if you run a poll and you find out that 30% of Muslims want 30% of Muslims in Indonesia want adulterers stoned to death, say. Then when you're criticizing that belief, you're talking about 30% of Muslims in Indonesia. You're not talking about the other 70%, and that's the whole reason why one would refer to poll results. And that's what I do. I'm consciously aware of and often saying, on this topic, we're talking about this percentage, and on this topic, we're talking about this percentage, and this is how else do you speak with precision about who you're talking about?
Well, I have a theory on how we can do that, and I'll get to that in a second. But I want to read some of your quotes now. Again, there are many, many like this, but to give people a sense of what I'm referring to, okay? So you say at one point, it is time we recognize and oblige the Muslim world to recognize that Muslim extremism is not extreme among Muslims. The truth about Islam is as politically incorrect as it is terrifying. Islam is all fringe and no center. I'll give you just one last one here. Unfortunately, in the case of Islam, the bad acts of the worst individuals, the jihadists, the murderers of apostates, and the men who treat their wives and daughters like chattel, are the best examples of the doctrine and practice. So that's among many quotes along those lines.
Right.
Sam, when people read those, can you not see that they, at a minimum, view those statements as giving people permission to generalize about Muslims? That you're not just saying Islam, you're not just saying fundamentalists, which is a point we often make.
Right.
You're saying they are the center of Islam. So when you say that, it seems like you're generalizing about Muslims.
Well, let's unpack this a little bit. So on many of these points, you are talking about a majority of Muslims believing X. So you're talking about 75%. You're talking about, so if it's a belief that the Quran is the perfect word of the creator of the universe, that is incredibly well subscribed. Every poll I've ever seen on that puts that at 90%. Just
Christian poll would be the same.
It wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be the same. Like, we can talk about those polls, but it's not. It's not in fact the same. It's half of that, right? Mm-hmm. But when you look at But again, there is variance on specific questions, and I will grant you that there is a difference between what people will say they believe and what they really believe when push comes to shove and they have to behave in certain ways. So there are people who will say, yes, I think apostates should be killed, and then there's presumably fewer people who would actually kill an apostate or celebrate the killing of an apostate. So there's a delta between professed belief and actual belief. But my point here is that we use this word Muslim extremism as a kind of euphemism. I mean, extremism, it's a misstatement, because extremism suggests that there's only a tiny percentage of people who would subscribe to these views, and that on virtually no question do you ever get a tiny percentage. So it can be the most extreme question. Do you want thieves to have their hands and feet cut off? Do you want people killed for adultery? Whatever the question is, you're never getting 3% or 5%, with the possible exception of some of the former Soviet states that have a Muslim population. You are not getting, when you ask these questions in Egypt and Sudan and Nigeria, and you can't even ask them in Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia, if you could, Iran, Iraq, when you ask these questions, you're getting even Turkey, right? Turkey, the secular, the poster boy for the success of secular Islam. You get percentages that are 30%, 40%, 60%. Yeah. And yes, well, you'd have to look at the Pew results.
Okay, so let's look at the Pew results real quick, okay? So now you brought up things that are important. That's why we have to actually go to some of the specific numbers there. And the reason why we do is because, and I want people to understand this. So when you say like 90% of Muslims subscribe to Quran being the word of God, etc. Right. And then you talk about it in the same sentence as cutting people's heads off, it leaves an impression like, oh, all Muslims believe that. But let's be more precise.
I want to address the other quote you just raised, though, because it's important here. You said that when I said some of the most extreme people, the people who are cutting people's heads off, are the best examples of the faith. It was something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Now, which is to say, this is a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda is living in such a way that it is a kind of paint-by-numbers approach to the Quran and the Hadith and the example of the Prophet. It's not, this is a very straightforward, very plausible, very literal implementation of what is recommended there. You smite the necks of the infidels wherever you find them. You can take sex slaves. I mean, this is all stuff that Muhammad did. This is all stuff this is not stuff that the Buddha did. It's stuff that Muhammad did, right? So this is my claim. If we found a totally isolated people on a desert island and we gave them the canon of Islam, the Quran, the Hadith, the biography of Muhammad, and said, here, this is all you need to know, okay? Live by these principles. And then we came back in 1,000 years and they were living like ISIS. There would be not much basis for surprise. Now, if we gave them the polycanon, the canon of the teachings of the Buddha, and came back in 1,000 years and they were living like ISIS, there'd be reason to be flabbergasted. There'd be no obvious connection
now
between.
You brought up like 8 things I got to respond to. But
okay,
let me. But now the island. I'm going to get back to the numbers.
Let me just say that is what I meant by saying that this is the best example of the actual doctrines in practice, because it is taking all of this very seriously and literally. It's, yes, women are worth less than men. Yes, that is a literal. Yes, you can take sex slave. That is.
So
you have to ignore those passages.
So I've got to address that. So listen, Sam, when you say that's the literal words in the Quran, that's why I left Islam, because I read that and thought that makes no sense at all, right?
Well done.
So, okay. Now, when you say, if you compare it to Buddhism, although Buddhists can be extremely violent and do bombings and beheadings, etc., but you know, that island, they might or might not, it depends on your interpretation of human nature. Are we all just driven to do that no matter what the text says? But put that aside.
It's a totally different point.
Okay, put that aside. Yeah. But if you left them on the island with the Old Testament or the Bible overall, they would be just as violent as Muslims if you left them with the Quran.
Let's deal with that claim.
So, okay, it's very important, and I got to go back to the numbers, and I got to go back to a lot of things, but it's very important that we understand your thoughts on that.
Yes. Okay.
Do you think that... go ahead.
Let's deal with that claim, then we'll get back to the numbers.
Okay.
So the claim is that the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity are just as violent as the scriptures of Islam, and therefore just as much of a liability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are a few
Yes.
reasons why that's not true. Now, it is true to say that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is the ugliest, most theocratic, most barbaric of all these texts, right? So it's worse than the Quran, in my view.
That's
right. However, there are differences that explain why Jews are not living like as prescribed in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and why they may never have really quite lived that way. First of all, some of the recommendations are clearly contextual and specific to what Saul was supposed to do to the Amalekites, and they're not generalizable to the future of humanity in quite the same way that.
Sam, that seems like an incredible excuse for it.
No.
It says
I'm not excusing.
kill all of them who do not believe in the God of Israel. Kill them all.
Let me finish. I'm not excusing. I've already conceded that it's the most barbaric book, right?
Okay.
I'm trying to explain why it is Jews find it so easy to rationalize not living by the lights of this text. Let me give you. Let me just talk. This is very important. So we just got to dig deeper. It's the most barbaric book. One crucial difference, apart from differences of the sort that I just mentioned, the crucial difference is there's no clear notion of paradise and hell. There's no promise of martyrdom. There's nothing. You're not going to get the 72 virgins if you're a Jew. There's not this.
No, but there is punishment. When Saul does not kill all of them, then God strikes him down.
But there's no basis for this ecstatic death cult where you want to get to the other lives.
Saul was told by God that he should commit genocide on the Amalekites.
Yes.
And when he did not, God punished him. So it is you have to make sure that you commit the genocide.
But it is much more about living in this world and waiting for the Messiah. If you are an Orthodox Jew, it is not about conquering the world for Judaism, right? There's not a missionary faith. Mm-hmm. You're not winning believers. You're not conquering by the sword. It's not convert or die, right? It is, we're waiting around for the Messiah to put things right. And again, I'm not discounting all of the harms of Orthodox Judaism. If you get me on the topic of Orthodox Judaism or conservative Judaism or the behavior of the Israeli settlers, I can be as vituperative as you'd ever want me to be. But there are differences that explain the difference we see between jihadists and Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn who are doing horrible things to women, and it's a very retrograde world they're creating, but they're not creating the same kind of chaos in this world. And I'll give
you're saying the principal difference is they don't care to convert you. Okay.
Well, no, and also this notion of paradise and martyrdom is the huge variable among jihadists.
Yeah.
It's the willingness, it's the eagerness to die, to get and to not only get into paradise yourself, but to get everyone you care about in after you, to get past that velvet rope in the sky. That is at the center of this death cult behavior.
So even if I were to grant you that, then we go to the issue of Christianity, which has all of the barbaric stuff that's in the Old Testament, right? And then, of course, conveniently, Christians will cherry pick and say, well, we don't agree with that part of the Old Testament, but we love Genesis, right? So it has all that barbaric stuff. It's in the Bible. And then in the latter verses, it says, oh, by the way, God is going to come back and kill you all, okay? First, you have the messianic situation. If you have the worst of all worlds, you have to convert everybody, okay? And if you don't convert everybody, God will kill you all, right? So, and you should look forward to that because your beloved Lord is going to come and vacuum you into the sky. Yeah. So if anyone is the most dangerous, doesn't it make sense that it is the people looking forward to Armageddon where we all die? Well, by the way, actively try to make that happen.
Okay, well, let's deal with that. There are certain circumstances in which Christian belief is worse than Muslim belief, or Islamic belief. And I talk honestly about those circumstances. I mean, one example, which is may seem far afield here, but it's very consequential, is just you look at the religious impediments to embryonic stem cell research, and the fact that we didn't just pull off the brakes there and do this research, full speed ahead. The impediments were Jewish and Christian beliefs about the souls entering zygotes at the moment of conception, and that you could have a petri dish with 3-day-old human embryos, which is just filled with souls that are every bit as important as the souls of our children or of people with Parkinson's disease, and we have to worry about how we treat these microscopic specks in petri dishes. Crazy idea. It doesn't make any sense. This is something I've talked about. I would never dream of criticizing Muslims or Islam for their role in this, because according to Islam, the soul doesn't enter the embryo until day 80 or day 120, depending on which hadith you believe. And so Islam is totally off the hook there. Embryonic stem cell research is compatible with Islam. Okay. So again, the crucial point here is to recognize that specific beliefs have specific consequences insofar as they're really believed. And that's all I'm ever talking about.
When we talk about the difference between Islam and Christianity,
let's talk about it.
Okay,
so there are circumstances where it's worse.
You frame, in so much of your writing, you frame Islam as it appears irredeemable, whereas Christianity is just as violent and perhaps more dangerous because they look forward to and want to execute Armageddon, right? And have tried in the past and are also currently trying.
You're being too loose with Christianity. Christianity is not just as violent. Christianity has a history of extraordinary violence, right?
By far, historically, the most violent religion on the planet.
Well, that I don't know what you're lumping into the Christian bin there, but that's debatable. But let's just talk about the centuries of...
Muslims didn't start the 2 world wars. Muslims didn't do the Holocaust. Muslims didn't do the Inquisition. They didn't do the Crusades.
Because of Christianity. The world wars were not because of Christianity.
That's complicated. When Christians do it, it's complicated. When Muslims do it, it's not complicated.
No.
It's because of Islam.
No. Okay, so this is another thing that we have to deal with. I am never blaming all Muslims for all the bad I'm never blaming Islam for all the bad things Muslims have done in history. I'm only blaming Islam for the things Muslims have clearly done on the basis of the doctrine of Islam. Okay. And so too with Christians, and so too with Jews and Buddhists and everyone else. And you have to be precise here. So for instance, you mentioned the Buddhists who are cutting people's heads off, right? You must be talking about the Buddhists in Myanmar. This. Now, there is no connection between what they are doing and the doctrines of Theravada Buddhism. There is just none. So what they're doing is horrible. What they're doing is an instance of tribal violence. It is, and the connection to religion is there because the differences between Buddhists and Muslims is defined in terms of religion, right? It's not. It's. I mean, there's probably an ethnic difference there too. There certainly is. But this is tribalism. It's xenophobia. It's hatred of the other. But it is not cashed out by the doctrine. It's not being inspired by the doctrine of Buddhism. It just isn't.
But then you're saying when Buddhists do it. Hold on. When certain Buddhists do it, I'm not going to blame all Buddhists because it is not connected to their doctrine. But when Muslims do it, it's not complicated. It is because of their doctrine, and hence we can talk generally and loosely about Muslims.
No, I am not talking generally and loosely about Muslims. And if you catch me doing it, then we just have to go into the details. So. I'm only there are Muslims who do horrible things, and it has nothing to do with Islam, right? They're just people. People do horrible. If a Muslim robs a liquor store, it's got very little to do with Islam, right?
Very true.
You know, and especially if he just grabs a package of bacon on his way out as well. I mean, it's not Islam.
Another reason I left Islam. Okay. Bacon is God's food.
Yeah. So all I'm asking for. And I will concede that because I've gotten so much opposition on this point that occasionally I'm pretty strident in how I ask for this, all I'm asking for is honest conversation about the logical connection between ideas and behavior.
So then let's go back to the idea of Christians versus Muslims, because I hope we're in the midst of that honest conversation. Yeah. So Christians, and I'm not saying you do it, and I'm curious what your take on this is, but I hear all the time from defenders of Christianity and from other atheists, but who happen to be born Christian, because we all get wedded to our identities and secretly want to defend it no matter how much we're atheists or agnostics. So they say, well, Hitler doesn't count because he wasn't really Christian, right? Except not only do we have the famous story of Gott mit uns on all the Bible on their belts that says God is with us, but Hitler literally said I am doing the Lord's work, and that is why I am getting rid of the Jews.
Right.
So why, but that doesn't count. Okay,
Well, no,
so then I would ask you this, because you
counts.
actually specifically talk about when Muslims say that they're doing it for Allah, why don't we believe them? We should take them at their word. So shouldn't we take Hitler at his
let's go
word
back to-
that
well-
he is doing the Lord's work on behalf of Christianity?
Well, actually, Hitler is often unfairly described as an atheist. So the Christian opponents chalk all that up to atheism, Hitler's atheism, because they don't really consider him a Christian. Now, Hitler spoke about Jesus in his speeches. Whether or not he was motivated by Christianity, I think, is debatable. But what is not debatable is that the anti-Semitism, which he got into his, drank with his mother's milk, and which was more or less universally subscribed in Germany for decades before the final solution, that is absolutely the product of 2,000 years of Christian fulminating against the Jews, despite the fact that Jesus was Jewish and all the apostles was Jewish.
I always found that unbelievable.
So, but
Your Lord was a Jew.
The
Anyway,
hatred of
yeah.
Jews, right, is the product of Christianity, and the genocide of Jews in Europe was absolutely the product of Christianity. And I've written about this. I've spoken about this. It's a horrible fact. And now, again, that doesn't entitle us to be less than precise about the differences between Christianity and Islam. And I will grant you that there are circumstances in which, given the right conditions, all of a sudden I'd be more worried about Christian dogma than Muslim dogma or Islamic dogma. And yes, and those, a fascination with the book of Revelation and the end times and the rapture and hoping to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque so as to bring this about. All of this is terrifying. And the fact that there are Christians who are hoping for the end of the world is again, many secular liberals doubt that this is true, right? But the real burden here, and this is what I run into with the Glenn Greenwalds and the Reza Aslans, is that people don't actually believe that others believe this stuff. They don't actually believe that people believe in paradise or in heaven or in the rapture.
So we half agree and half disagree there, Sam, because I totally agree with you that some people absolutely believe, and it drives me crazy, as it does with you, that when people say, oh, nobody really believes that. That's not true. 32% of this country, the United States, is fundamentalist Christian, okay? Now, you can argue about definitions, but they're evangelicals. They say that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, right? Which they can't possibly believe, because then they'd murder everybody, right?
Well, no, they have again, this is one difference with Christianity, and these are important differences. One difference is you have this notion that Jesus, his grace supersedes all of that Old Testament law, so that you can have, as a devout Christian who thinks that it's all perfect, you can find a rationale to ignore the Old Testament barbarism, because Jesus has delivered his doctrine of grace, right? And then you get the Sermon on the Mount, and you take Jesus and half his moods, and you get very benign, very pacifistic attitudes. Now, Jesus, when he comes back on the Day of Judgment, is going to be wielding a sword and throwing sinners into a lake of fire, and all of that's weird. But in the meantime, you can find, as a Bible-thumping ignoramus who's against science and who's against evolution, and who thinks evolution is a hoax, etc., you can still find a basis to just wait around for the rapture, and you do not find a basis for holy war and a desire for martyrdom and all the stuff we're seeing in the Muslim world. You just
Sam,
don't.
You
just
even
don't.
said in some of your writings, and again, there's a pile of papers here, and I wish I could find the exact quote for you, but I think you'll remember it, that there's, of course, in the Bible, there's the famous line of give unto Caesar what is his and God what is his, right?
A very important line.
Right, very important line, and that's part of what you're alluding to. But in the Quran, there's also a line that you've written about that says, don't enforce your religion on others, right?
No compulsion in religion.
No compulsion in religion, right? Which, by the way, a great majority of Muslims agree with in the world, right?
Yes.
So, and in Islam, there are great parts too, don't get me wrong. So there is the idea that all the races are equal, and that was not necessarily the case at the time that the Quran was written. That certainly people didn't think about it that way, and that's why there's so many Indonesian Muslims and German Muslims and Muslims of all different races, right? So there are good parts that you can cherry pick in any religion and bad parts that you can cherry pick in any religion. So that's why I'm not getting why you I think, seem to think that Islam is irredeemable, whereas Christianity is redeemable.
Well, let me say I hope it's not irredeemable. We have a lot riding on the prospect of redeeming it. So I'm under no illusions that we're going to convince 1.6 billion Muslims to be atheists. So it has to be redeemable. So and I'm in dialogue with someone who I consider to be a genuine Muslim reformer now, Majid Nawaz, about just what is the way forward for the reformation of that all of us are waiting for in the Muslim world. So that's not my view that it's irredeemable, or at least that's a very bleak picture. But again, we have to be honest about the difference between Christianity and Islam here. And
but I'm not seeing it. I mean, we just had a whole conversation about it.
We're not done. We're not done. So
okay.
One very important piece here is the example of Muhammad and the example of Jesus. Muhammad was not a hippie who got crucified. Right, Muhammad was a conquering warlord. Muhammad's ethics, his life course, has much more in common with Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan than it does with Jesus or with Buddha or with Mahavira or other progenitors of the world's, quote, great faiths.
Yeah, but Jesus wanted to conquer the world. He just sucked at it.
No, well, that's one way to say it. But he was not ordering people's heads cut off. He got crucified.
Have the power to.
Well, no, you're reading that into the situation. But I'm saying the ethic you get out of Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount doesn't give you, okay, let's cut the heads off of those 300 Jews and let's take sex slaves.
That's right? If you want to cherry pick the good parts of the Bible, there are plenty.
Yeah, but
there are plenty.
But the bad parts are not as extensive. It's much easier to cherry pick the good parts.
No, we just talked about how the bad parts are extensive, if not worse.
But let me just tell you the difference here. First of all, the Bible is a vast and vastly self-contradictory book, right?
Yeah.
So the cherry picking is made so much easier by the fact that there's no way to there's no truly central message, and especially if you're taking the Old Testament and the New Testament, and you can forget about half of it very easily. It would take you a month and a half to read the whole thing from cover to cover. The Quran is a much shorter, much more streamlined book, and it has a central message, which is very much in harmony with the example of Muhammad. It is not the central message of the Quran, arguably, certainly a central message, is you should spread this one true faith to the ends of the earth, and you spread this by conquest, not conversation. It is convert or die, or if you happen to be a person of the book, you can live as a dhimmi. Now
So Sam, that's a very important distinction though, because the Quran says don't touch the Christians and the Jews, they're people of the book. And of course, it's also wildly contradictory in different parts. And there's a very legitimate case to be made that when they talk about infidels, they're talking about the pagans of the time. Okay. And so...
But that's cold comfort to 1.2 billion Hindus who are polytheists and just completely beyond the pale by the light of this doctrine, right? Mm-hmm. So... but I want to deal with your points.
But the Christians want to convert them too, and if they don't convert them, it doesn't matter because they're all going to get blasted by God at the end.
Okay, but that is to be a fiction, and that's very different than waging war in this life against these people. Okay, the Yazidis are not being killed by the Iraqi Christians, right? And there's a reason for that.
But then when you get into the real world, Sam, instead of the hypothetical world of the doctrines, right? Again, in the real world, there's two things that are very important that happen. One, historically, Christians have cherry-picked the good parts at times, Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, etc., and they have picked hideous parts of the Bible for slavery, the Inquisition, the Holocaust, the anti-Semitism, and the list goes on and on and on. So historically, I mean, on Holocaust alone, let alone everything else I've mentioned here, Christians win. They have been the most violent.
Okay, but again, you have to be more careful here because the Holocaust was not a straightforward and honest implementation of Christian doctrine. You can't look into the Bible and get a good Christian justification for the Holocaust. What you get with
Of course you can.
No, you can't.
Of course, it says kill them all that don't believe.
Not for Christianity. No, it doesn't. It simply doesn't.
First of all, it's in the Old Testament, which is in the Bible. People pretend it's not in the Bible. If it wasn't in the Bible, we just have the New Testament.
Jesus and the central message of his teaching does not get you the Holocaust. There's not a straight line there. There is a straight line.
It seems like a total excuse to be honest.
It's not an
with you,
excuse.
Sam.
But then look at the differences in the real world. Why aren't, I mean, this is practically a science experiment, right? You've got Christians in many of these Muslim communities that are being mistreated by the West, or being mistreated by the Israelis, or just living in very unlucky circumstances. You have Christian communities. You have Iraqi Christians, or you used to until they started getting killed and pushed out. You have Lebanese Christians. You have Christians in the West Bank and Gaza, presumably. Where are the Christian suicide bombers? Where are the Christians cutting the heads off of Yazidis? Where's this death cult behavior among Christians?
So gas chambers don't count? You have to physically cut somebody's head off?
No, but here's a science experiment. In this same year, you have people living in the same kinds of conditions, right? I mean, the Christian Palestinians have to go through the same checkpoints as Muslim Palestinians, right, in Israel.
Well, I have an answer to that.
Okay, what is the answer?
Okay, so it's not specifically in Palestine, but in Northern Ireland, what did they do when they felt they were oppressed and they were occupied? They bombed civilians, right? What did the Tamils do in Sri Lanka? They bombed civilians. When they felt that they were oppressed and occupied, they always bombed civilians.
No, I can talk, no, but they don't always, because we are not seeing the Christian suicide bombers. Mm-hmm. Right, so we can talk about Ireland.
Okay, but hold on. If you're being incredibly specific on suicide bombers, okay, we had Buddhist suicide bombers, kamikaze fighters. Okay, so we've had them all.
Okay, let's not be so scattershot here. So I can talk. I've written and spoken about the link between Zen Buddhism and the kamikaze pilots. Right, so you can get a death cult out of some quasi-Buddhist ideas. Now, Zen Buddhism is different from Theravada Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism, and it's not actually a stretch to see how it doesn't emphasize compassion in the same way that, for instance, Tibetan Buddhism does. So when you see Tibetan Buddhists mistreated by the Chinese, they're not practicing suicide bombing. They're practicing self-immolation. They're burning themselves, right? They're not blowing themselves up on buses, and it makes a lot of sense given their religious dogmas, right? The connection between the Buddhism and the kamikaze pilots is drawn from Zen, but it was also kind of Japanese nationalism and Shinto, and it was kind of a weird brew of a militaristic doctrine there. But it is easy to see how Zen was helpful there, right? I'm not denying that. But again, we have to be honest about the degrees of remove from a very clear doctrine and behavior.
So, Sam, this goes to the heart of the issue. This goes to the heart of it. Go ahead.
So it's easy to see how we could make the Quran worse, right? So we could make it better and we could make it worse, right? It is exactly the way it is, and certain lines are open to interpretation, but it would be worse, for instance, if it didn't have that line that there's no compulsion in religion, right? When you take that line out, you've just taken out one tool that moderate people have to resist all the other barbarism there. And it's easy to see how it could be worse. It could be on the bottom of every page. It could say, oh, and by the way, don't forget, you have to kill those homosexuals, right? On every page, it could reiterate that. That would be a more emphatic exposition of a doctrine that's already in there, but to emphasize it to that degree, we would expect more homophobia and more murders of homosexuals in the Muslim world as a result. And if there was a single page in there that said, listen guys, homosexuality is a totally natural byproduct of evolution. It is love between a man and a woman is just as legitimate. There's no problem here. You should just honor it. If that doctrine were in there, it would be, you wouldn't find a hatred of homosexuals.
So and we've been over this. What you're saying is that the doctrine matters.
It really matters.
But Sam, I don't disagree with that.
Okay, so you had to raise Aslan on here for an hour saying that the doctrine doesn't matter because it's all about.
No, I don't. But I don't agree with Reza, and I said throughout that I don't agree with Reza. Reza talks about how the truth is something that was a concept that came up a couple of hundred years ago. I mean, that's a nice linguistic turn,
tell that
right?
to Plato.
Right? Yeah. So I don't agree with that. That's why I'm agnostic. That's why I don't believe in any of the religions, right? Because, no, there is a truth. 2 + 2 does equal 4.
But you're still resisting
right? You're resisting
specific consequences of specific beliefs.
No, I'm not. I know that Islam, by having the things that are the damaging parts in there, lead to sometimes bad results. I believe that it is part of the mix as to why people do the suicide bombings and all the bad things, right? I believe that there is plenty of that in the Bible that has led to all of that as well. In fact, when you talk about homosexuals, again, who's killed more homosexuals in history? By far the Christians.
The
by
Christians
far.
are equally culpable on that front.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So, well, not equally. Worse. Okay.
Well,
So,
wanting to kill homosexuals is bad in both contexts. I mean,
That's
it's
exactly my
dangerous
point,
to be.
Wes.
It's probably more
I'm sorry.
dangerous to be homosexual in the Muslim world at the moment. But.
Sam, that's exactly my point. My point is that Christians have done worse to homosexuals, but it doesn't really matter because both don't like homosexuals. It says it in the text. It says it in the doctrine, right? So there's no need to say Islam is worse or Christianity is worse. So that's what I'm saying when we talk about the heart of the issue.
Why
Sam,
ignore
hold
the
on,
differences?
hold on.
Why ignore the
Hold on.
differences
Now,
between
when
the
you
faiths?
okay, hold on. Now, when you say okay, the doctrine of Islam is worse, which we still have a disagreement on that.
Let me just remind you what I said about stem cell research. The doctrine of Islam is totally off the hook on that. So now why don't you object to me saying that? But why not object to my saying that? It's an accurate thing to say, but you seem to be going down the path of, oh no, they must be equally bad here.
We're coming back to the disagreement on whether 2 + 2 = 5 or 6 is worse, when there is plenty enough bad material in all the religions that if you wanted to go in that direction, you would have plenty of excuse to do so. And Christianity has done that in great abundance, not only in the past, but they still do it today. Okay. So the question to me is not whether your text sucks, because I think it does. I think it does in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Islam, and in many of the other religions, but not all and not to the same degree. But they suck enough that it gives you excuse to do violence, right? Okay. So now given that, when you have the Tamil Tigers do the terrorism when they're occupied and oppressed, and you have the Catholics doing it in Northern Ireland, and you have the Muslims doing it in Palestine, is it not fair to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's not just the religion, that religion, yes, unfortunately contributes to that and is a damaging part of the mix, but obviously there's also geopolitical factors involved here, which leads them all to the same result.
Okay, well, let me deal with 2 points here. One is, there's still the differences, the specific and often tiny differences between the faiths really matter in terms of even though they both suck equally in terms of the barbarism that's in there, that seems to be, these texts can't be edited. So the barbarism of Leviticus and Deuteronomy is there for all time, if you're a Christian or a Jew, and likewise with the Quran for Muslims. But because of tiny differences in theology, the different groups have different tools available to them to ignore the barbarous passages for all time. So for instance, the line you cited from Matthew, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, unto God that which is God's, that is a huge and long lever that you can pull to just separate politics and religion. It's just render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, okay? It's just religion's over here, politics is over there. And that it does immense work for some certain number of Christians. There is not the same logic of separating man's law from God's law in the Quran and the Hadith and the example of Muhammad. There just isn't. This is a huge problem.
So I agree and disagree on that as well. So the part I agree with you on is I've always thought that one of the huge problems with Islam is this marriage of mosque and state, if you will, right? So that's that it's definitely in the books, and it's definitely something that is practiced far too often. Not all the time, and not in different cultures. And I think culture makes an enormous difference. And so that's a whole part of another part of the conversation we can get into. But at the same time, Sam, if you were right that it was so central that you couldn't do without it, well then, we've talked about how other religions have done equally terrible things, if not worse things. But let's talk about whether Muslims can do great things, good things, and things where they cherry pick the good parts and not the bad parts, right? So, for example, the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest Muslim empires in world history, of course, right? So did they kill all the infidels? No, they didn't, right? Did they kill a lot while they were conquering? Sure, as any conquering empire does, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, etc., right? But they were incredibly open to the different religions, and they in fact would give autonomy to the different parts of the Ottoman Empire as long as you paid your taxes. Okay, you got to pay your taxes, otherwise they'll come and kill you, right? But if you paid them, they don't care, and they give you autonomy to do whatever you want. So, and the original Arab Empire that was the rise of Islam was more liberal, was more scientific, more advanced than the Christians were at the time. So it is possible, and we have seen throughout history, when Muslims are more liberal, more scientific, more advanced. So what part of that is irredeemable? What part of that it makes it impossible to cherry pick the good parts?
Okay, well, you can cherry pick the good parts, and you can ignore the bad parts, and you can just not pay much attention to the doctrine, as many millions of Muslims clearly do, and that's a great thing. And I think the future of humanity depends on us, religious people, unwinding their attachment to this notion of revelation in the first place. So the idea that these books were inerrant and dictated by the creator of the universe, we have to become less and less convinced of that proposition and ignore these doctrines more and more, and that's the path forward for everybody. We need a secular world. So Muslims clearly can do that to some degree, right? This history you allude to, this is increasingly we're getting a politically correct and romanticized history of the ages of Muslim tolerance and how good life was for Jews and Christians under Islam when the Christians were barbarians in the Middle Ages and launching aggressive wars of conquest against the Crusades against the Muslim world. What you had were Christian barbarians attacking a highly cultivated and otherwise peaceful Muslim world. Okay, this is largely a fantasy. It's largely cooked up in the novels of Sir Walter Scott and Benjamin Disraeli. I mean, the idea of Andalusia and things being great for Jews.
No. So that's also 50-50. Well, if people talk about a utopia, that's crazy. They conquered people.
We're not going to that here, but I'm just saying that people should be suspicious of how good life was.
But the Ottomans did rescue hundreds of thousands of Jews from the Inquisition. Okay, now it was largely for probably business reasons and the empire and the maintenance, but they said, we'll take the Jews off your hands. That's a fact, right?
Yes, but the problems continued, and Maimonides, it's often said that Maimonides recognized how great life was in the Muslim world, but this is just not true. He was in continuous flight from persecution, and he referred to Muhammad, I think, as the madman. So he was not a fan of Islam. In any case, the comparison with the height of Christian insanity in the Middle Ages is obviously, it's of course, life was terrible for Jews in medieval Christianity. So you have a civilization that is completely deranged by its religiosity, where people are being burned alive for heresy and witchcraft, and you're talking about ages of the starkest ignorance, where people, the bubonic plague is ravaging Europe, and all the Christians can think to do is start cutting the tongues out of blasphemers, because they have no idea of how people get sick, and they just think blasphemy must be the cause, right? So you're dealing with a completely deranged religious world, and yes, then by comparison with Christianity at that point, Islam looks rather good, but. Again, and we're not going to adjudicate a different interpretation of history here, but I'm just saying that there we have a romanticized history about how good life was under Islam, and how jihad and fundamentalism is somehow a new phenomenon. It's just the Wahhabis who were jihadists, and we've had 1,400 years of jihad. So that is a fact of. Jihad is not an invention of the 20th century.
So Sam, I don't romanticize it at all, and of course back then the things that happened would shock our conscience today, right? But when you compare the Muslim empire to the Christian empire back then, or the Christian, it's hard to call them empires, but fiefdoms, etc.
Christendom, yeah.
Right. Well, the Muslims were comparatively more liberal. They built libraries, whereas the Christians didn't, right? They cared more about science and math than the Christians did.
They were spreading their faith by jihad, and the Crusades were a response to 300 years of jihad. I mean, the Crusades were not just. The Christians didn't wake up one day saying, "Let's just conquer the world." They were dealing with continuous attacks from the Muslim world.
There you go again. So I feel like when I hear you talking about Israel, when I hear you writing about it, or I read you writing about it, it always feels like, well, it's always the Muslims' fault, right? So the Christians, they did the Crusades because they were provoked by the Muslims. And Israel does the bombings where 75% of people are killed are civilians, but the Muslims made them do it, right? So, and you write the Jews are the least of the offenders, right? And so can you not see that when somebody looks at that and goes, well, that's a nice coincidence. Here we go again. It's the Muslims' fault because the Muslims made the Jews kill the Muslims. Right?
Have you read Letter to a Christian Nation?
Mm-hmm. So I know.
Did you see the kinds of things I say about Christianity?
You know, I know that, Sam. Right? So, but when you make the distinction that you do, where you say, well, Christianity, not quite as bad as Islam. Judaism, definitely not as bad as Islam.
No. I'm just saying that there is one difference, and it's an important difference, is that neither Christianity nor Judaism, for reasons that are not so easy to describe, but they're there, neither has a straightforward doctrine of jihad as holy war. Mm-hmm. And Islam has a absolutely straightforward doctrine of jihad as holy war.
But Sam, even the word jihad, so I'm not an apologist for it, where some people say, well, jihad just means an internal quest to find God,
yes,
right?
I'm talking about the holy war.
Right. So, but it could easily be interpreted that way. If you want to cherry pick the good parts, it could be interpreted that way.
It cannot easily. We absolutely have to convince 1.6 billion Muslims to interpret it that way. I'm with you there.
Right.
It's not so easy. Mm-hmm. It's not so easy historically. It's not so easy with reference to the example of Muhammad, and it's not so easy just reading the books.
And the reason I keep coming back to that point is not to be a Muslim apologist or anything along those lines. It's to talk about the root causes of why we have the situation that we have now.
Let's go back to politics and geopolitics.
So that's what I want to eliminate the idea that the doctrine makes such a difference, and we can't eliminate because we don't agree on it. But from my point of view, that the doctrine is so bad in both cases and potentially good in both cases that is not the determinative factor. Like you say sometimes, well, if the Muslims could do whatever they wanted, well, they'd kill everybody. They might do a genocide based on what they have said, right? The Palestinians, etc. Whereas we know the Jews won't, because they don't kill all the Palestinians, because they can, but they don't, right? But the Muslims also ruled the world, and they didn't kill everybody. And in fact, the Christians did kill or tried to kill all the Jews, and the Muslims didn't. So it couldn't be the doctrine alone. It just can't be.
No, the doctrine of Islam contains, as we've described, this notion of dhimmitud, where the people of the book can live in an apartheid state subjugated politically and economically by their Muslim overlords. That is, if it didn't have that that's different than killing.
You're talking about Christianity in America today. We have a Sharia law with the Supreme Court where 5 Catholics say, no, you shall live under our interpretation of Catholicism.
Okay, that's a lateral move we don't have to make. That's not the. I'm answering your question.
There are overlords. That's why I made that point.
The doctrine of dhimmitud is different from a doctrine of genocide, right? This explains why the Muslims didn't just kill all the Christians and Jews under their power, right? They have a doctrine which gives them a reason not to, right? The doctrine matters.
But they didn't kill every Hindu they ran into. They didn't kill every pagan they ran into.
No. They had the borders. Yes, Islam historically was in a more or less continuous state of conquest, war with its neighbors. It spread virtually to the ends of the earth. I mean, how do you think Islam got from Portugal to the Caucasus to India to sub-Saharan Africa? It was not through conversation. It was not through interfaith dialogue.
So this again gets to one of the central issues, Sam, because how do you think the British Empire, the sun never set on the British Empire? Conquest. So all, the Portuguese, the Spanish.
We're changing the topic of conversation.
No, we're not
saying
changing
other
it.
people haven't. Okay, but again, don't be confused about what I'm saying. I'm not saying that
Sam,
all
let me
wars
finish
are
that
religious.
point. No, let me finish that point because it's important. So my point there is, Sam, that whenever the Christians do it, and they do endless conquests and endless wars, we find excuses. Well, I mean, it's not necessarily exactly because of Christianity. It's complicated, which is actually true. It is complicated. It's not just because of Christianity. But when Muslims Muslims do it, we don't say, or you don't say, it's complicated, that there is a great number of reasons. There's political reasons, there's cultural reasons, there are doctrinal reasons. You say, well, it's because of Islam, they are driven to conquest, but the Christians are also driven to conquest, but they're driven to conquest, and that's why they do it. And it appears, and correct me here, because this is important, it appears you're saying that if not the only reason, the predominant reason why they do it as opposed to the Christians and everyone else.
There are circumstances where Christians are behaving badly and it's purely the result of their Christianity, right? So Christians who go to sub-Saharan Africa and preach the sinfulness of condom use in AIDS-ravaged villages are doing something absolutely horrible that would be unthinkable but for this crazy Catholic dogma against contraception, right? So this is this is Catholicism in practice, you can draw a straight line from the doctrine to the behavior, and it's incredibly harmful, right? Yep. That's an example, right? Yep. Now there's other things that Christians or Catholics happen to do that are bad, where you can't connected to doctrine. It's just people behaving badly who happen to be Christian or Catholic, right? And there's things that are in the middle where there is some loose justification based on doctrine.
So it is complicated for Christians, but it's also, you're saying, complicated for Muslims.
It's potentially totally complicated for Muslims too.
Okay, great.
So there are circumstances where you can say, oh yeah, there's a massive political, economic contribution to this problem, right? Then there are circumstances where you can say, there is zero political, economic contribution to this problem, and it's pure ideology. When someone in Marin County or Orange County some white guy who was raised Christian or Jewish, wakes up and gets really into Islam and starts reading all the books and goes to the local mosque and gets radicalized, right? And he decides to go fight for ISIS. That's not economics. It's not politics.
Yeah, I disagree with you.
Okay, well, so that'll be an interesting disagreement. And I'm arguing in most cases, it's not psychopathology. It's not. ISIS is not acting like the bug light for the world psychopaths. There's an ideology of, we can call it radical Islam, global jihad,
yep,
which is very captivating to a certain type of person, and it is almost perfectly designed for export. You don't have to be affiliated with Al Qaeda or anybody to get the full meme downloaded onto your brain, and it justifies a certain kind of behavior. If you really believe that this book is the perfect word of the creator of the universe, if you really believe that martyrdom is the straight and only truly straight path to paradise, bypassing the day of judgment, if you really believe these things, and again, most secular liberals doubt that anyone believes these things, and that's a real impediment to thinking clearly about this, but if someone really believes these things, these become rational acts. Going to fight for ISIS becomes totally rational. You don't have to be a depressed person that's hoping to die. You can be
Sam, so here's our disagreement on that.
Okay.
So we don't disagree that Islam contributes to that. I totally agree with you. Okay, if you say it's the only reason, that's, I think, clearly not the case, and I'll tell you why. So, for example, and I'll come back to the convert example in a second. So, Kurds sometimes, they have wonderful parts of their culture, but they all have unfortunate parts of their culture. One of which is they do female genital mutilation much more than other Sunni Muslims in the area. Okay, right. So it is more specific to their culture. It's also specific to some African cultures, whether it's Muslim or Christian, right? They do honor killings more than other Sunni Muslims in the area. Okay, so it is obviously somewhat cultural. Now you could look at that and go, wait a minute. Now they got that from the text of the Quran, so it is.
I wouldn't.
Now female genital mutilation is a bad example there because they didn't get that from the Quran.
But even honor killing. So honor killing is. There's a lot of support for it in the doctrine of Islam, but honor killing, I would be the first to admit, is a bigger problem than Islam. Hindus do it. I mean, this is a deeper patriarchal, misogynistic thing in us that has been expressed in the Quran to some degree and in other religious scriptures, but it predates religion. and religion isn't the pure engine of this behavior.
So the reason I bring up that example is because there are sometimes cultural factors that are more important than religious factors, but it certainly are in the mix of the reasons why people do things. Yes. Now, in the case of the American convert that goes over to fight ISIS.
So I completely agreed with you here. So just acknowledge that. I mean, so that's you weren't expecting me to agree with you. You think that I'm sort of on record saying that no, honor killing is purely the result of Muslim doctrine, right? That's not something I've ever believed. I just think there's
tremendous nuance in your points and my points. I don't view anything you say in a blanket statement. That's why I want to have this conversation so that it's clear, right? And so go back to the idea of the convert, right? Yeah. So it seems like, well, he looked at the Quran, he got convinced by the Quran, and he wants to go and fight the jihad, and that's what drove him to do it. So is that a large part of why he did it? Of course. Do I even think that it's the predominant reason why he did it? No. I think that guys like that are very similar to the mass shooters that we have in America. They are looking for glory. And they're going to find a vehicle for their personal glory. It might be that they're going to get famous by shooting up the school. It might be that they're going to go and fight for Allah. It could be that they're going to fight for Jesus. It could be one of a great number of things. That guy is driven by his personal psychology far more than he is by the religion. But I'm not saying that religion doesn't have a role in it. I wish that religion didn't exist and didn't give him the excuse to do that. That maybe he'd find a different excuse. But I don't know about that. But it is definitely, again, a mix of factors.
Okay, well, I would, that's a very hopeful belief which will not survive scrutiny of these specific people. So if you look at specific, mass shooters, right, you find, yes, there are people who want glory, but you also find a lot of obvious psychopathology in these people. These are not, for the most part, high-functioning people. And many of them are depressed. Many of them are suicidal, and they're just going to go out in a blaze of glory. That is not what you find with this phenomenon of global jihad. I mean, people have looked at this. Psychiatrists have looked at this. This is not. You can find very high-functioning people who have other opportunities, right? These are not people who woke up one day, they were so hopeless, they didn't see how they were going to get a job, they didn't love their family, they didn't even have a family. You can find people who have families, who have good kids, who are veterinarians or neurologists or engineers, who decide to blow themselves up or to attempt to do it waging jihad.
So now I'm not qualified to get into Robert Pape's analysis
I am. I can talk about Pape.
Of suicide bombers and terrorism and what drives them. Obviously, you know that he presents, at the very least, a very solid case, right? You might disagree with it.
It's not. So I'll tell you why it's not solid.
For the people who don't know, just so we clarify, he says that that the overwhelming majority of terrorism is because of national political reasons and not because of religion. Okay, so you should read up on him and get context for that for those of you who are interested in that. Yes, go ahead.
So Robert Pape is someone who has been very influential, not in security circles, but in sort of apologist circles. People love the punchline, which is, this has nothing to do with religion. And this is the thing I keep running into, that people either don't believe or they don't want to believe that anyone ever really believes what they say they believe here. So that no one really thinks they're going to get virgins. No one's really expecting to get to paradise. No one, when the jihadist says we love death more than the infidel loves life, that's just propaganda, right? And no amount of people blowing themselves up will convince the average secular liberal that these people really mean what they say. Now, Robert Pape has done an analysis of suicide bombing, and he's argued that, as you say, it's the result of nationalists and political and nationalist concerns, and it's a tactic used against democracies to get them to, occupying democracies, to get the hell out of town, right? And it's a very effective one because people don't like being blown up. So the problem with Pape's analysis is that he's one of these people who goes into it sure that no one really believes what they say they believe. Every religious claim is just a cover for a political or economic or nationalist claim. And here the game is rigged. If you're always going to look behind someone's religious claim to find the political claim or the economic claim or the psychopathological claim, as you just did, you'll never stop at the religious claim. You'll always look for something deeper. But no one ever does the opposite. No one ever finds someone who's making a very strong political claim for their motives, and then looks for the religious claim beneath it. So if my neighbor, if goes and kills someone, and he's asked why he did it, and he says, well, listen, I wanted his stuff. I saw his great car and all his stereo equipment. I wanted it. I didn't want to leave a living witness, right? So I just did it, right? No one's gonna doubt his motive. He said something perfectly sensible, right? So this was a straightforward claim of a murderous intent, right? And it made sense. Or if someone blows himself up or does something outrageous, or attempts to blow himself up, and you ask why, and he says, well, I was just so hopeless. They had stolen my family's land. I saw no way out. I saw no way forward. I had nothing to live for. I just was filled with hatred for these people who had mistreated me and my family this way. So I behaved this way, right? No one is going to look at that and say, oh, no, that can't be the reason why he did that. There's no way. Why would you? But when someone says, I wanted to get into paradise, right? I want the 72 virgins. I believe all this stuff. Someone like Robert Pape says, that's never the reason. And what he does is he defines as nationalist agenda. So someone, like Al-Qaeda's goals, according to Pape, are nationalistic, because Al-Qaeda talks about wanting to get the infidels off the Arabian Peninsula. He views that as nationalism. That only by the most cockamamie definition of nationalism can you describe Al-Qaeda as prosecuting a nationalist agenda.
But Sam,
everything is through the filter of theology here.
I'm not in that camp. So I'm in the camp.
But that's Pape.
No, but I'm in the camp of, as I've now said like probably 7 times, it's a mixture. So if Robert Pape or anybody says religion has no factor to play, that's crazy. Okay,
yes.
But
Many
if you say that religion is the only or predominant reason, and that's where we should end the analysis, I also don't agree. Okay.
There are situations where, but for religion, you cannot imagine this person doing what he just did.
Yeah, and we have a disagreement there.
Okay, well, but
I can't imagine it. I could imagine it for nationalistic reasons,
but
psychological
but then there are
reasons, depending on the
situations
person and depending on the circumstances.
Okay, but there are circumstances where a person has not been oppressed by anyone. He has no rational terrestrial grievance.
Same with the guys who did Columbine. They weren't oppressed by anyone. They were perfectly middle class.
But we can explain
they lived in
their
good
behavior.
families.
These guys had obvious mental problems, right?
So
Jared Loughner.
That's what people are really object to that, because whenever it's a non-Muslim, they have mental problems. When it's a Muslim, well, they don't have mental problems just because of Islam.
Okay, there are Muslims who have mental problems, sure, right?
Right.
But there are clear cases. I mean, the burden is on you to explain how this behavior is so contagious, right? How are all these people leaving normal lives, right, and going in? Let's just take the local case of going to fight for ISIS.
All these people, though.
No, thousands of people in 100 countries. I mean, many thousands of people.
But out of 1.6 billion people, I mean, how many? We've had about at most a dozen people from the U.S. leave, including a couple of girls today was in the news.
Right. But it's many thousands. It's many thousands from the free world. Right?
Okay. Now, yeah, that's easily explainable. It's a tiny fraction, Sam. And yes, they feel that the Palestinians are being oppressed. They feel that the Holy Land is occupied. They have all these different reasons for it. Okay, so now let me go. I've been dying to go to the viewers' questions, and you guys have had great questions. This is an appropriate one for this. So let me ask you Yvonne Guzman's question. He says, Sam Harris usually, there's an email that he wrote, uses testimonies of Muslim terrorists, as you were doing here, where they claim that religion is the reason for their acts, to ridicule those who say that religion is not the only explanatory variable for this behavior. Okay? He says, very often Harris says that we have no reason to believe that religion is not the main motivation for terrorism if the same terrorists say it is, just as we were talking about here. He says, my question for Sam Harris is, if it is his opinion as a neuroscientist that human beings always know the deepest motivation behind each one of their actions.
No, it's not, and that's a very good question. Clearly, we can be wrong about our motivations, right? But when there are certain cases where it's more or less reasonable to suspect somebody is wrong, and so that we can set up an experiment where you are going to be manipulated by subliminal, priming, where you're going to think you did something for reasons where we know that the thing that tipped the balance is something you're just not aware of, right? So I give you a list of words, all of which have something to do with the ocean, ocean and seashore and shell and beach, and you look at these words, and then I say, name a laundry detergent, and you're going to think Tide, or you're very likely to think Tide, you're not going to think whatever the other one you could have thought of. So, and you're not going to know, we could set it up in such a way that you're not going to know that that's why you thought of Tide, right? But when you're talking about a massive commitment of time and energy, when you're talking about explicitly represented linguistic beliefs, right, where these are conversations people have, these are books people read, these are things they espouse, and you're talking, and it's all is logically coherent given the beliefs, right? And it's highly illogical given the absence of the beliefs. Then simply asking people why they did something is usually the best way of getting information about why they're behaving the way they did. So it's like, why did so?
So I'm 50-50 on that too.
But
I don't often think that that's the case.
But let me just
sometimes
add,
it is.
No, but so it's like why? Whatever,
But Sam, we have to at least be fair about that, right? So if you say it is often the reason why people do things, so then you have to say when Hitler says, "I did the Lord's work in killing the Jews," right, you have to take him at his word. He did it because of Christianity. But actually, I wouldn't though. Even I'm using that as an analogy, and I don't think that's fair.
It's a bad analogy. I can give you an analogy where it's crystal clear for Christians. That's just not one of them. There are Christians who do absolutely outrageous. If you roll back the clock to the Middle Ages, where they're burning heretics alive, right? There are Christians who again, it's not such a straight line from the Bible, but it's a straight line from the underlying belief of believe the right things about God and Jesus, or you're going to go to hell, right? Mm-hmm. So a belief in hell is actually very, very dangerous, and because just think about this: if I thought that my neighbor was torturing children in his basement, right? I would call the cops immediately, and if the cops wouldn't show up, I would kick down his door myself, right? I mean, I would be highly motivated to stop him. Now, just imagine believing that it's possible for my neighbor to espouse such a dangerous system of ideas, a heresy, that he will lead his children, and potentially he'll lead my children, to suffer in hell for eternity, right? Imagine really believing that. Well, then all of a sudden, the state, it's impossible to keep your religious beliefs private. Then your neighbor across the street is more dangerous than the guy who's just torturing kids in his basement. This guy is spreading ideas that could lead to eternal damnation. Now,
okay, look, I've got to address two parts.
Medieval Christianity was populated by many, many people who believed that. Right, and as their behavior showed. Mm-hmm. Now again, that's not the most straightforward enunciation of Christian doctrine, but it is there at the core. Once you believe that the stakes are that high, heaven and hell, eternity, then you can
Sam,
get diabolical things out of it.
Okay, so I agree with you that the people who did the Inquisition, you can draw a straighter line from Christianity to the Inquisition than you can from the Nazis to the Bible. Right. It is a spectrum. Okay, yeah. It is a spectrum, and somewhere on that spectrum, Hitler meant what he said to some degree and didn't mean it to some degree. But when we talk about Muslims today, I'm not sure you agree that it's a spectrum, or you think they're all on this end of the spectrum.
Of course, there's a spectrum.
Okay, so then we agree.
But the problem is you think that the fringe is much fringier than I think it clearly is, based on polling data, based on the straightforwardness of the doctrine, based on a few other things we've touched on, however scattershot. But you think it's far more marginal than I think it is. But I totally agree. There's a spectrum, and the spectrum is one of the degree of belief in specific doctrines.
Okay, so now let's finally turn to that part of the conversation, which is also very important, which is the consequences of these beliefs, right? And I don't mean the beliefs of the religious fundamentalist or the people who adhere more strictly to the doctrine, etc. I mean our beliefs. So if we believe that it is Islam that is predominantly driving them, if we don't want to say entirely, say predominantly driving them, well, then we might reach different conclusions than if we believe that it is a mixture of things that are driving them to violence. Nationalism, maybe in some cases, there's psychological issues, politics, economics, and religion. So the very good example, of course, is the Palestinians, right? Mm-hmm. So the Palestinians believe in suicide terrorism more than almost any other Muslim country or culture or community, right? So obviously, I think it's obvious that part of the reason that they believe that is not just because they believe the Quran even more than the other Muslims. No, it's because they find themselves in an occupation, and in an occupation, you almost always resort to terrorism. It's not the right thing to do, it's a horrible thing to do, but that is what almost all religions and all different nationalities have done.
Do the other side of that experiment. Tell me what the Palestinian Christians are doing in the same condition.
Now, that is, again, complicated, Sam, because the Palestinian Christians are a tiny minority, so they don't have the power to take the matters into their own hands, even among the people who are occupied. But when Christians are the majority, the Catholics are the majority in an occupation, as we saw in Northern Ireland, they do terrorism.
Northern Ireland, that's a confusing example. It's not a great analogy. I have in the past ascribed religion to be the cause of that, but it's not religion in a straightforward way. It's the religion. It's similar to what's happening in Myanmar with the Buddhists and the Muslims. It is the tribalism based on religious identity. It's not the clear expression of doctrine. They were not fighting over the transubstantiation of the communion host in Northern Ireland, right? Mm-hmm. So that the doctrinal differences between Protestants and Catholics was not the problem. But the identities were the problem. And so religion was not helpful, but it's not the same kind of straightforward implementation of ideas.
So, but wait, it seems almost a perfect analogy to the Palestinian situation. The problem is identity, right? So one side says we're Muslim and we're Palestinians, the other side says we're Jewish and we're Israeli, and they butt heads forever, and the Palestinians feel oppressed and occupied, and they resort, because of identity issues, just the same way that the Irish did and the Catholics did in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying that the death cult behavior of suicide bombing is given immense impetus by specific beliefs, in this specifically the belief in martyrdom and paradise.
Sam, honestly, you might disagree here, but isn't that a tiny difference, the manner in which they do the terrorism? Because we have shown that there was suicide terrorism in Buddhism, right? We've shown that there is non-suicide bombing terrorism among the Christians, the Tamils, the Buddhists, etc., right? So to me, it seems like that is not the largest factor. It seems like the largest factor is the same geopolitical situation they find themselves in.
Well, no, because again, the problem is, so to some degree, we're just talking about the differences with which we weight these various factors.
That's right.
Right. So,
That's right. But that has large implications, as we're going to get to.
But the first thing to acknowledge about this convergence we're noticing here is that there are many people who fundamentally disagree with both of us here, and it's a problem. There are people who think that religion is just not a factor.
Right. We don't agree with that.
Okay. And you and I are going to disagree in specific cases about the contributions of psychopathology and the contributions of politics to certain instances of violence.
That's right.
Now, one, I think, great blind spot of liberalism, and I think you're certainly going to be blinded by this more than I feel I am, is the default assumption that people everywhere want the same things, basically, and they would be disposed to behave the same ways, with or without religion. Violent people are going to be violent, peaceful people are going to be peaceful, irrespective of their religions. And when you see people, a certain group of people, behaving really badly, they must have some good, easily understood reason for this. And therefore, most of the enemies we have, probably all of the enemies we have in the world, are enemies we've made. We based on our own missteps in foreign policy, we based on the history of colonialism, have made these enemies. And we whack the hornet's nest, and now we're reaping the results. That is, in certain cases, true, but as a general matter, not true with respect to this phenomenon of global jihad, and that is a big difference, but a big difference in terms of the ultimate lesson
So
from
that's
this
another
conversation.
place where we disagree, because I think whacking the hornet's nest is clearly a bigger factor than religion, even in the extreme example of ISIS. Because if we hadn't whacked the hornet's nest, we almost certainly would not have had ISIS. So
we can talk about that. It's not. That's a very, as I said in one of my blog posts. If the lesson is, don't depose somebody like Saddam Hussein because worse things are going to happen, that says almost nothing about us. It says something very depressing about the state of the Muslim world.
There are different ways that you attack a problem. And so Saddam Hussein was a problem. This doesn't mean that he should stay there forever, but there are different ways to address that. Now, if we had not overturned the apple cart, and we had done things like the Libyan action, which I was in favor of, okay? And that was the first thing that had happened. Arab Spring happens, Egypt goes to kind of democracy, which then backtracks partly because of all the things that are swirling around, Tunisia, etc. And then we get to Gaddafi and we depose him in the way that we did. That actually could have been controlled and it could have been contained, and maybe we would have led to a road down democracy because it was more organically driven by the Libyan people. But when you go in and you just knock Saddam Hussein out and you go, okay, we have no plans, Sunnis and Shias, have at it, right? Then you're going to create ISIS and you're going to create things worse than Al-Qaeda. So that is what I talk about when I talk about the spectrum, the mix, and why politics oftentimes is more important than that mix. So now let's go to the practical implications of what people are worried about your beliefs, right? So now, again, with all the papers, I want to give credit to the person who asked it, but I'm sorry, I can't find the exact paper there. But one of the people that emailed in asked, so look, you say that it's not Muslims, but it's the doctrine of Islam. But when you talk about profiling, one of the things that people criticize you for, right? Well, then if it's not a race, then how can you profile? And I thought that was an interesting question and one that I hadn't thought of. So I know that you throw yourself into that mix as a person who looks nominally Middle Eastern, maybe kind of. It's okay, I get that part.
It's not that I look Middle Eastern, it's just that you can't obviously rule me out as someone who could not possibly be a jihadist.
Right.
Now, let me just talk about the basis for that. No, Islam is not a race, right? But
so then how do you do profile?
We've all been, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about security and violence and the logic of violence, the ethics of violence, and it's also just true that we have some very serviceable intuitions about who is likely to be an aggressor in any circumstance. You're standing on an elevator and somebody gets on, do you have to worry about this person or not on the topic of violence? We have good intuitions about these things, and we shouldn't, based on a politically correct desire to appear fair, deny that humans have intuitions on this. And so if I'm standing at the TSA line at the airport, and I look around, on any given day, 20%, 30%, 50% of the people there are obviously not jihadists. It's obvious enough that I'd be willing to bet my life that they're not jihadists. I can point to the woman who's 65 years old and just got back from Tucson, and she's got all her paraphernalia, all her kitsch, and she's talking to her husband, and they're in flip-flops, and I look at them, I hear their conversation, I get the whole gestalt, and somebody better trained than me could do a better job of this, right? Attention is wasted doing a pat down on these people. And now, let me just finish, because some people are going to think what I've just said is completely insane.
Right.
You have to search their bags because anyone can put anything in a bag, right? But we have $10 worth of attention, and we can spend it any way we want. And if you spend $1 on these people, you are losing $1. It's just a bandwidth problem. We don't have an infinite amount of scrutiny, right? And so my sense is that if people are going to die at some point, if there's another airplane incident, now again, I was talking about profiling specifically in airports. If another plane gets blown up by a suicide bomber, I think political correctness will be part of the problem. We will have paid attention to people who were obviously not worthy of another moment's scrutiny. I've been in an airport where I saw a toddler from a family who everyone in this room would bet their life that this is not a family of jihadists, based on lots of micro cues, right, and based on some just statistical assumptions that were reasonable to make. And yet I see a TSA officer take this screaming little girl aside who's terrified to search her shoes. This is something that Richard Reed did to us till the end of time, right?
Yep. Just talking about on the show today how much I despise him.
What I advocated in that piece on profiling is what I called anti-profiling, not profiling Muslims, not profiling Middle Eastern people, or not racial profiling, but acknowledging that we know what we're looking for. We're looking for jihadists. We're looking for people who have a certain construal of Islam and are willing to die and want to die this way. And then we have to look. The filter has to be: do these people stand a chance of being jihadists? Now, again, it's possible they could recruit, Okinawan women someday, and then we have the problem of, wow, they beat our profile. They could recruit, blonde octogenarians from Norway, right? But the basic fact is, we know that's much harder to do. They're not doing it, and again, someone like me falls squarely in the profile. I don't get the short line in this situation.
I understand that. So, and a lot of people will look at that and say, okay, look, there is Sam calling a spade, and he's being reasonable, et cetera. Now, let me disagree in a number of ways. Okay, so am I in favor of profiling? Yes. Okay. But the question is how you profile, right? Do you do it what factors do you do it on? Do you do it on race? Do you do it on religion? Which is actually, again, as we talked about in the beginning here, actually impossible in the case of Islam, because there's so many different races that are in Islam that you can't even do it based on that. Or do you do it based on actions, okay? And other things that we have seen that other terrorists have done. So, for example, 2 examples. One is, if someone is profusely sweating and they seem nervous, of course, check them more than the Norwegian grandmother, right? So that is a reasonable way to profile. That's exactly what you should be doing. You know why? Because I travel all the time, my family travels all the time. I don't want the plane to blow up, okay? Yeah. Another thing that you could look at is, are they clean shaven? So you and I should get profiled more than people who are not clean shaven, in my opinion, okay? Because on 9/11, they made sure to shave before they went in so they wouldn't arouse suspicion. Now, that might be wrong, right or wrong as a factor, but I get that could be a factor, right? But so if you're doing it based on specific actions, perfectly sensible. But if you do it based on religion, 1, it's not doable. 2, if you do it based on race, it gets my second objection. Even if you were right, which I do not agree to, okay, that is a good determinative factor. Now I'll tell you why I don't agree with that in a second as well. It's that it has a second terrible consequence, Sam. It then says, for example, stop and frisk in New York. We are going to stop 96% blacks and Latinos. Now, could you show me some numbers that show that blacks and Latinos get arrested more often than whites in New York City? Yes, you can. Is it partly because they get stopped more? Yes, that's true too. But even if I thought they were more inclined to do the crime, which I don't believe at all, but even if I thought that, I still wouldn't stop and frisk them disproportionately. The reason is you separate the races and you make the problem worse. You make it an us versus them. And it is fundamentally unfair, and it splits us as a society, and that's not what we're about. So when you do it in this context as well, it has such damaging effects as on top of what we've discussed that I still wouldn't do.
Okay, well, what I was recommending again was what I call anti-profiling, which is just not wasting time, obviously. So what you have in the TSA, and this might be changing a little bit because now we have lines where you can be pre-screened, this global entry. Where you're pre-approved, but what I was objecting to was the security theater of this obvious display of fairness, which is an obvious waste of time, right? Where we're all standing in line, taking our shoes off, watching. I've seen people forced to get out of their wheelchairs, people who could barely stand.
It depends. Let me say why it depends on a couple of reasons. One. If you're talking about a 4-year-old, we've never seen a case of terrorism for a 4-year-old, doesn't mean it can't happen. I understand what you're saying, and I think that's a fair thing to do based on the actions of 4-year-olds. They've never done a bombing before. It would be very unlikely.
What you're worried about with a 4-year-old is a family that would be willing to blow up a plane with their 4-year-old on it.
Right, but if you're talking about a wheelchair, Well, I would actually check the wheelchairs more than anything else because it's filled with metal. So it depends, right? So, and in the Norwegian example you keep bringing up, okay, Norwegians don't bomb airplanes. But if you apply that across the board and said, okay, well, we can check Norwegians less in security matters, well, you would have let Breivik slide by, and he is one of the biggest mass killers we've had in recent memory, right? So it turns out anybody could be a mass killer. So it's not an efficient way of profiling. Action is much more efficient. Whereas if you were doing it on action, you'd say, this guy looks weird, his eyes are twitching, he looks crazy.
You do it on everything. You take political correctness out of the equation, right?
I'm happy to do
It's just based on all of the statistical knowledge you can get in any moment, based on raw intuition. I mean, you want well-trained people in the TSA. You don't want people who, this is, currently it appears to be a job. I'm sure the churn rate there is just astronomical. I don't know how long people hold these jobs, but it's not a high status job, right? So you would want, if you really wanted a good security apparatus, you would want well-trained, well-compensated people. You'd want like the people who do it for El Al in Israel, and they make no. There are no illusions about what's going on when you go. I don't know if you've been to Israel, but you go through Ben Gurion Airport, and listen. We don't want the plane to blow up, and we're not going to be necessarily polite about this. And we're going to talk to you as long as we want to talk to you, to find out whether we need to worry about you.
The reason they're talking is because they want to see if they can see cues and clues.
Yes,
that I have no problem with. In fact, I've talked about how LL does it on the show before,
okay, but
and it's based on action.
No, it's not just based on. I mean, that is a PC myth that is just based on action. It's based on everything. It's based on whether you've been to Pakistan. It's based on your passport, your nationality, absolutely your religion, the look in your eye, everything. It's based on whatever a well-trained person can get off of you in the split second or the hour it takes to vet you.
So Sam, when you combine the things we've been talking about, one of the issues, and I want to move on to the other stuff which is even more dangerous, and we're at some point going to run out of patience, you and I and the audience, etc. Is that, okay, we talk about vast numbers of Muslims, as you talk about. You say it's mainly connected to their faith, so we have to be especially careful about them, right? And then we say, well, we should, if they, based on whatever it is, race, or they've been to Pakistan or whatever it is, we should look forward to profiling them, right? When you put all these things, that's not the best way of putting it, but they get profiled more than others do, right? When we put all these things together, a lot of people then come back and go, I mean, at a bare minimum, Sam, you are giving permission for people to generalize about Muslims.
Okay, well let's
and that's dangerous. In the words of Sandra Day O'Connor, when she was talking about a different topic about the dictatorship, even in America, Sandra Day O'Connor said this. Right. She said, "Let us avoid those beginnings so we could avoid those endings." Okay, and that seems like a dangerous beginning.
It's a. Well, it depends on how it would be implemented, right? So it's a dangerous beginning if there's some grotesque apparatus that causes anyone who sort of looks Middle Eastern to suffer a 4-hour ordeal at the airport where white guys just breeze on through, right? It's unfair, it's inflammatory, it's not, the thing that we should want, and the thing that all Muslims, frankly, should want, is the thing that would be totally rational and would dial down the risk of this kind of terrorism on airplanes to the lowest practical level. So presumably 99.9% of Muslims getting on airplanes don't want to be blown up by a jihadist, right?
Of course.
And presumably an honest person of whatever faith will admit that the next person who blows up an airplane is more likely to be Muslim than Amish or Methodist or Mormon, and the list goes on. It's not that no one else could do it. It's not that a Breivik couldn't do it.
But to your $10 example, we only have $10. If I'm checking all the Muslims, I'm wasting so much of that because we agree that 99.9% of them are not going to do it. So what we're looking for is the shifty dude who is acting like he might bomb the plane.
Yeah.
If we spend our $10 on that guy, it's going to be much better spent.
Oh, no, of course we spend the $10. We pay attention to behavior, absolutely. So let's put behavior at the top of the list, right?
Mm-hmm.
Behavior is the most important thing. The guy who looks like a maniac who's about to die, right? That's whatever that looks like,
Richard
right?
Reed.
That's we want to pay
Looks like
attention to that
Richard
guy. Yeah, well, Richard Reed was he looked that was a great mugshot, if nothing else. But so I'm saying all the information has to anything that is valid information.
And I'm saying the reason
use
you shouldn't put religion or race among those factors is because it leads to other dangerous things. So let's get to that part of the conversation.
Right.
So when you say, hey, you know what? Maybe there are circumstances under which we can do torture, right? And we've already set the table with all these things we can do to Muslims, like profiling maybe, and that's a factor. It's not the only factor, it's a factor, et cetera, right?
That's not a fair summary. It's not, everything I've said about profiling applies to me, right? I'm not a Muslim. So if I whatever profile, and again, I don't know the details of how to implement this.
You do say, I mean, let's be honest, we should do it more to people who look Muslim.
No, anyone who could, we should not pay attention to people, we should pay less attention to people who couldn't conceively be Muslim.
But also,
right?
By definition, more attention to people who could conceivably look Muslim.
Yes. And I put myself squarely in that category. So
I don't think you're. I know that. I get that. So I'm not saying you're biased in that regard. I'm just saying it's a bad idea.
What did John? Okay. But what did John Walker Lindh look like? What does Adam Gadon, the American Al Qaeda guy, look like? He shaves his beard. He looks like me, right? So whatever regime I would implement if I were the profiling czar applies to me. It's not doesn't just apply to you.
I don't think you're biased there.
But many of my critics don't get that, and I'm just saying that we shouldn't obviously squander our resources.
I understand you completely, and I've stated why I still think it's a bad idea, despite that.
Fine.
Okay, so now, look, when you turn the issue of this gets to the heart of what so many people asked. Right, you've got the torture issue that you brought up. You got the nuclear strike issue that you brought up in your books, and you're going to, of course, explain that in a sec. And the list goes on. And I actually think the part about what we should do with Middle Eastern countries, whether democracy can work, whether good economies can work, et cetera, is worse, to be honest. Okay, when you have all of that, what people are asking constantly is, okay, Sam, so what do you want to do with Muslims? So, like, what's the answer? What's the answer?
I want to encourage an honest conversation about the link between beliefs and behaviors, and get us to marginalize.
What conclusion do you reach?
Get us to, based on conversation.
But conversation is easy, Sam. We've had the conversation.
It's not easy. It's profoundly difficult. You should see the kinds of conversations I have with someone like Nick Kristof of the New York Times, right? Who will not admit that there's any link between religion and behavior, right?
Okay, but in our context here, we've had the conversation and we know what our agreements and disagreements on those issues are. But then, all right, then finish the conversation. So what do you want to do with that?
The kind of conversation I'm having with someone like Maajid Nawaz now, and the kind of conversations he's trying to have with radicalized people in the Muslim world. He's trying to deprogram jihadists. He's trying to deprogram Islamists. We have to figure out how to inspire a reformation that is credible within the Muslim world, that gets Muslims by the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, to one, honestly acknowledge the link between certain doctrines and behavior, which is something that someone like Reza Aslan absolutely does not do. And if he does it, if he's starting to do it now under pressure, he hasn't been doing it, and he's very shifty on this point. Where someone like Maajid Nawaz, just straight up, he acknowledges the doctrine. He's a former Islamist. He knows why he was an Islamist. He's no longer an Islamist. He knows why he's not an Islamist anymore. He understands what he believed and why, and so it's all in plain view for him. You have to honestly talk about the consequences of believing certain doctrines. You have to honestly talk about the numbers of people who do believe these doctrines, and you have to find some way of waging a war of ideas with these people in the Muslim world,
Sam,
which discredits these interpretations of
if you
the text.
Were left at war of ideas, then we would be back to almost complete agreement. Okay, I totally agree we need a war of ideas, when I was getting the Freedom from Religion Foundation Award, for Emperor Has No Clothes Award, for work I did in media, the speech I gave was about a culture war. That the Fox News of the world say there is a culture war. I actually agree with them. And I think we should engage in that war, and we should defeat religion. Okay, so there we have complete agreement. Right. But I'm afraid, as I read your writing, that you don't leave it there. That that you talk about, again, the bombings and the practical policy. In fact, I can't, to be honest with you, and that's why to answer here, when I read your policy prescriptions in foreign policy, I can't tell it apart from a conservative.
Okay, well, can you?
Okay, so like,
I'm happy to talk about all of it.
So, first of all, when you talk about, well, maybe Muslims can't handle democracy. Again, if I'm stating it wrong, which I'm sure I am in parts, and I've got the quotes, but there's 100 pages, right? And you're here, and you can tell me. Yeah. I'm really worried about that line of thinking. I think that's wrong, and I think it's a little dangerous. It sounds almost. But it's actually, to be fair, not neocon, because the Bush doctrine was they can't handle democracy, we should do the freedom doctrine, right? So let's start there, because then we're going to get into the nuclear strike, et cetera. But so start on do you think they can handle democracy, or why did you say that you're worried they can't?
It's not just Muslims, it's just any condition where you're talking about a despotism that has kept a lid on sectarian chaos or just dysfunction. You talk about how do you move from either a failed state or a totalitarian one to democracy, right? It matters who's there and what they believe and what they want to do with all that freedom, right? So if you have and what we're seeing, so you pull the lid off of the sectarian conflict in Iraq between Sunni and Shia. You kill Saddam Hussein and his psychopathic sons, and then you just watch and see what happens. It's, as you said, totally irresponsible, because what you unleash is sectarian horror, right? And so in that sense, we created ISIS. We didn't create ISIS we didn't create the sectarianism between Sunni and Shia.
That's right.
But that was a prison state, right? And we killed the warden. And then how are prisoners going to behave who just have all these animosities?
But Sam, clearly the right idea isn't to put more wardens in.
Well, no, but I think you could. It's possible, and this is a conversation that has almost nothing to do with Islam per se. It has to do with just humanity. How could we fix North Korea? Right, North Korea is a hostage crisis. They've got a lunatic with bouffant hair keeping tens of millions of people hostage,
right? Yep.
And they are information starved too. They think they're a master race, right? They're 6 inches shorter than South Koreans, but they think they're a master race. So you have it's not religious. It's quasi-religious in the degree to which the dear leader is worshipped and the degree to which they're starved of information. But this is a bizarre psychological experiment where you have millions of people living in they have a delusional worldview, and they're starving to death, right? And in a perfect world, the civilized world could say, we're going to go in there and save these people, because they need saving, right? But how do you save them? Well, one, the leader's got nuclear weapons, and so it's very hard to do anything. That's one reason to stop nuclear proliferation, because you can't go save people when the maniac in charge has nuclear weapons. But what would happen if we just killed the dear leader and then created a democracy in North Korea? Who the hell knows? But these people might not be ready for democracy in the next 20 years. There may be an argument for some kind of benevolent dictator transition to democracy.
Ooh, that sounds uncomfortable.
Well, no,
okay.
Emphasis on benevolent. I mean, so you put someone in charge who really.
No, but that's a hypothetical, Sam. There are no benevolent dictators.
No, that's not true.
Really? You want to take that chance?
Not in principle. It's not true. There's no benevolent dictators. They're not many historically. But the question is, if we had a truly benevolent project, I think that most of the world feels, apart from how scary the leaders of North Korea have been, most of the world feels just bad for the North Koreans, right? If we could, we would help these people. The question is how to help them. And I mean, you're talking about a generation of people who do not have. I mean, not only do they not have the institutions that would allow for a democracy, who knows what they believe about the nature of reality.
So Sam, a couple of things there. Number one, I would never say that the North Koreans or the Muslims in any particular country are not capable of democracy. Of course they are, right? Now you're saying, I think you're saying is, I hope you're saying, of course they are, but they might need a 20-year transition.
Sure, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
all right. So that's better than some interpretations of what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay. Now, but even in that 20 years, that creates two different problems. One, I don't think it's true because, for example, Ataturk in Turkey took the caliphate, crushed it, and said, we now have a democracy, and we did. Now, it's not all roses.
Yeah, it's not all, but he was also a bit of a dictator. I mean,
Now, but he had those tendencies, and he took some of those actions, but he did transition it to democracy,
yes,
right?
Okay.
And he did it over a very short period of time. So it's not like it can't be done, and it's not like it can't be done with Muslims, and it's not like it can't be done with the people who led the Muslim world. So obviously it can be done.
It can be done, it has to be done, but if you look at what's the fruits of the Arab Spring are at best ambiguous at this point, and probably more horrible than that.
So then
how do we do it?
So the Arab Spring is incredibly messy, and I agree with you that however you do any transition, you have to be inordinately careful. But when you say benevolent dictator, I go, no way, right? Because I don't even know what that means. What does that mean? Like, how would we do it in the real world?
Cockamamie thesis. I mean, there are political scientists who look at the transition from dictatorship to democracy or failed state to democracy and see it as a problem that is difficult to solve. It's not just a matter of just dyeing everybody's finger purple and saying you voted. I mean, you need the institutions. You need this is hard to do, and we obviously haven't figured out how to do this. My point, and again, this is not something I spent any significant time writing about. I think this is a footnote in The End of Faith, and I think it's been a very long time since I've thought about this, but I think it was due to something Robert Kaplan, the war journalist, said about on this topic. But yes, the transition to democracy is, of course, Muslims are just human beings. Yeah, the next generation of Muslims in every Muslim society. The Muslims who are now 18 months old, right, are not Muslims, right? They don't follow the doctrine of Islam, right? They're just human beings, right? I want to reach those people as much as you do, and I consider them to be as valuable as any other group of 18-month-olds on Earth. And they're capable of democracy, they're capable of physics, they're capable of all the beauty of the 21st century. Let's give it to them, you know, and let's figure out how to intrude into their lives with ideas in such a way so as to get them to recognize that we.
Again, I 100% agree. Okay, but on the issue, but the dictator thing is important, Sam, because it's real, right? So we actually did that experiment. What we did was we put in dictators in Iraq and Libya and all these different places, and we left them in power for a period of transition. And what happened was Islamic militancy got worse, not better, right? So ideas matter, as you would say, right? So I think that's the wrong idea and the wrong direction to go in. And plus it has the other problem that it creates an aura, again, the context of your work, where people think, okay, well, now we got the generals, allows people to generalize, yada, yada. And now we're talking about dictators over Muslim world. Do you see it? Do you see like where they go, whoa,
I'm
that
not recommending
really...
No, I'm just saying I'm observing what everyone else observed about the Arab Spring and the war in Iraq before that. It's just removing a dictator and claiming that democracy is now the new regime isn't enough, and it creates chaos, right? But more often than not, I mean, judging from the last decade and a half, we have the example of Saddam Hussein was one of the most evil men who's ever lived. I mean, and again, this was a hostage crisis, and I was not for the war in Iraq for a variety of reasons. One being it just looked like a crazy distraction from the war in Afghanistan, which seemed to me legitimate and necessary.
That's what we talk about on the show all the time.
So, but for just pure you could have justified a war in Iraq for purely humanitarian reasons. Now, I'm not saying, now, again, this is a point of confusion. I'm not saying that we went in purely for humanitarian reasons, but I'm saying you could have. You could have looked at this, just as I described North Korea, as a hostage crisis, and this guy's a bad actor. He keeps shooting, trying to shoot down our planes, enforcing a no-fly zone. You could have, the civilized world could have said, we're going to remove this guy, and just appealed to all of the Iraqis on the ground to just watch us do it, right? Don't fight us. We're gonna take, the Wicked Witch of the West is going to be dead in a fortnight. That could have been a completely benevolent thing to do. But again, here is where we have to be honest about the role that Islam plays in making this unworkable. That was just the sheer fact of infidels doing it was a sacrilege to a significant percentage of the Muslim world. You had Muslims who on Wednesday hated Saddam Hussein as an insufficiently Muslim tyrant, who on Thursday were behind him because he was being attacked by infidels, right?
No, but Sam, I disagree with that analysis, and I'll tell you why. Because we liberated, okay, and it's got its own problems, etc., but roughly so, Bosnia, Kosovo, right? Yeah. We did that. They were Muslim. We helped them, and we were not perceived as infidels. We were not perceived as hostile. We were perceived as enormously friendly to the Muslims.
We did not invade Muslim land. That is different. We did not invade Muslim land, and we really don't get credit for that. I mean, the Muslim world doesn't give the West credit for the liberation.
Certainly did, and the people in Kosovo did. And so my point there, Sam, is that it is not a universal Muslim reaction. It depends on the political context.
Well, I'm not saying
where
it's universal.
We actually helped the Bosnians and the people of Kosovo, we were thanked by those people, right? When we went to Iraq, and we have a long history of doing that for corporate reasons, for reasons of subjugation, etc., we were justifiably and correctly viewed with enormous skepticism. And they were roughly right.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with that. But but yeah, I think you're downplaying the degree to which there is a. And again, this doesn't speak so much to specific doctrines. This speaks to tribal solidarity based on religion, more like what was happening in Northern Ireland. You have a reflexive solidarity, you have an in-group, out-group thinking where you have Muslims and people of all religions, but especially Muslims at this moment in history, siding with other Muslims just because they're Muslims, no matter how badly behaved they are.
So that again goes to the heart of the issue, Sam, because part of the reason they're doing that is that in this particular time and political context, Muslims, rightly or wrongly, and I think it fairly rightly, they feel subjugated, right? And they feel humiliated. And so they desperately search for answers, as our ancestors did when they came up with religion. I don't know, it looks like there's holes in the sky. Let me try to figure it out, right? I'll make up a story about it. In the case of the Muslims now that feel humiliated by the West, they feel like, well, when were we big? When were we great?
Right.
Oh, when we were the most Muslim under Muhammad, which is actually not necessarily true, but that's the mistaken impression they have. So let's go back to that. Maybe religion is the answer. Maybe Islam is the answer. See, Sam, when I was growing up, and Salman Rushdie talks about this too, come back to it in a sec. Islam was not, the number of Muslims in the world were not nearly as much fundamentalist. There was much smaller percentages. Pakistan was not as fundamentalist. India was not as, the Muslims in India were not as fundamentalist. Turkey was not, almost no fundamentalism in Turkey, right? Now there is some, right? And the part of or I think a very large part of the reason for that is that Muslims in the world feel humiliated and they're trying to figure out an answer. And so they're lashing out and saying, yes, Islam, that's it, jihad, that's what we should do.
All right, well, again, you're using words like humiliated, which in most conversations, seem to describe some rational, terrestrial, normal political grievance. But I argue that all of this is being seen through the lens of religion. So the humiliation of the Muslim world is based to an extraordinary degree on the doctrinal expectations of Islam. I mean, Islam is supposed to be a triumphant religion. It is supposed to conquer the world. It was in the process of conquering the world. Muhammad was a conqueror. He didn't get crucified. There's a very different expectation of how things should look on the ground if things are working correctly. We are in a fallen world where the one true faith is not winning. It is a sacrilege.
But Sam, then we go back again. There's many different examples you can use. But let me use Turkey again.
The Hindus do not have this view. The Jews do not have this view. The Christians do not have this view. The Christians understand that it's not a matter of winning until Jesus comes back.
But the people of Kazakhstan don't have any feelings of, conquest of the world. The people of Kosovo don't necessarily feel that way.
No, you're not paying attention to the triumphalism and the notions of supremacy that run straight through Islam.
No. And the reason why the Turks are not doing jihad in general is manyfold,
yeah, but
right?
Ataturk, you mentioned him.
Right.
They had secularism,
and secularism was we were programmed to be secular in Turkey, literally by our education system. So that's an enormous part of it. But the other part of it is, and you see this in other countries as well, is that economically, Turkey's doing much better. It's among the top 20 economies in the world. So they don't need to, they don't feel humiliated. They don't need to do global jihad. They're doing fine.
What about all these richer Gulf states that are exporting the ideas of global jihad everywhere all the time, and they're just pulling money out of the ground?
So that's a combination of factors. So in Saudi Arabia, we know historically that the Al Saud dynasty had to strike a deal with the Wahhabis, right? Mm-hmm. And so they now, as part of that, I mean, you want to talk about a deal with the devil, right? Ironically. Mm-hmm. They have been spreading Wahhabism throughout the world, which is a scourge upon the earth, okay? Yeah. So that is a unique situation in Saudi Arabia. Could it be that the other Gulf states know that they're not going to conquer the world with their limited oil?
ISIS. I mean, you have wealthy people who like ISIS, right? Now, some of these wealthy people are cynical, and they're just afraid of ISIS, and they just want to keep ISIS elsewhere.
That's right. I mean, that's a huge part of the Saudi bargain.
Yeah, and they're afraid of the radicals in their own population who, so they just want to export this ideology to the rest of the world and keep their own extremists contained. But it's just a fact that a commitment to jihad, a support for jihad, is uncoupled from economics, and it's uncoupled from education. As economics go up and education go up, a radicalism goes up. It's not the poorest of the poor who are the jihadists. It's the engineers who are the jihadists. And that's a problem. So this is a very PC fantasy, which it would be great if it were true.
We're talking about micro and macro issues. You're talking about a micro issue of that particular engineer or doctor doing what he does, right? Whereas I'm talking about macro issues of a country that is doing economically better is less likely to produce a culture that is steeped in jihad, et cetera.
I certainly hope that's true. I don't know that we know that that's true.
Okay, yeah. And so that is why the culture matters more than the religion does, and I think the geopolitical context matters more than the religion does. But look, we got to go to the nuclear strike because, again, it affects all other issues. So now, you did not say we should do a nuclear strike on anybody, right? But you said we should, and correct me where I'm wrong, we should consider doing a nuclear strike, a first nuclear strike, under certain circumstances. I find that to be incredibly dangerous talk.
Okay, but it is a dangerous fact of the world that we have nuclear arms, right? We have nuclear arms because we have already considered doing a nuclear strike under certain circumstances. That is what the Cold War was about. Yes. So this is the world that we're in right now. If we could uninvent these weapons, that would be great, right? But we have a nuclear doctrine. And it developed entirely in a Cold War context, where we were faced with the Soviet Union that was, for all of the flaws and all the ideological quirks, this was not a death cult and did not have the basis of being a death cult. These were rational actors, and their hopes and fears and aspirations were constrained by terrestrial concerns. These were not people who could say, we love death more than you infidels love life, right? And again, this is just 2 paragraphs in the End of Faith, right? This is not me talking ad nauseum about nuclear policy, but in just a very kind of game theoretic way, I asked us to consider how a belief in martyrdom, a belief in paradise, just unties this convention of mutually assured destruction as a deterrence. The Cold War was possible because neither side wanted to really play a game of chicken. When you're playing a game of chicken with someone who wants to get to paradise, you're screwed. You're going to lose this game of chicken, right? So, and the moment you accept, and again, many people don't accept this for reasons I cannot fathom, but the moment you accept that certain people really do believe in paradise, really do want to die and to get there, right? Or they're hoping to be martyred. This is that death today would not be a bad thing for them. And then you imagine us failing to keep the big bombs and the long-range missiles out of their hands. You imagine a regime that is just like ISIS, but they've got ICBMs. We have to find some way to avoid that. And the Muslim world in particular has to find some way to avoid that. The Pakistanis that already have bombs, right? They don't have the missile technology, but they have the bombs. They're a coup away from delivering these bombs into the hands of the Pakistani Taliban. We have to find some way to avoid that.
But Sam, the reason why I think your idea is dangerous is because it makes the likelihood of nuclear strikes far more likely. Because if you say to the Iranians, we think you're part of a death cult and we don't trust you, even though the Iranians, like them or dislike them, have been very rational actors throughout, okay? There are enemies in a lot of ways, as the Soviets were, right? But the Soviets were also rational actors, even though we didn't agree with them and they were our enemies. If you say to the Iranians, we're so afraid of your death cult or whatever we think your intentions are, that we might do a first strike on you, you make it far more likely for them to do a first strike on us.
Well, or, I mean, that again, that's an interesting conversation from a game theoretic point of view. It could be that you make it far more likely for them just not to build the bombs in the first place. You say
that has not been
how
things have developed.
No, but
either in this context or any context.
You just have to play it out. So listen, you have a belief system. We're taking you seriously. I mean, you're the people who are waiting for the Mahdi, and you're hoping. You realize that this world is just an antechamber for the world to come, and you want to get there.
I'm going to interrupt for 1 second here. You don't really think the Iranians think that?
No, I think I agree with you that there are people in Iran who think that, but they have not been in control. So yes, no, Iran is distinct. I'm not saying that Iran is Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. I mean, all of these groups are subtly different. But what I was asking in those two paragraphs in the End of Faith was for us to consider the possibility, the horrible possibility that must be avoided at all costs, that a regime that is the psychological equivalent of the 19 hijackers, people who really are willing to hit the wall at 400 miles an hour, gets long-range nuclear weapons.
The second huge problem of that line of thinking, Sam, which is that if you start going down that road of assumptions, well then we would do the unthinkable. So I'm afraid that what people they're going to take you seriously, right? You're doing it as a hypothetical, and you're doing it as a game theory, etc. But neocons can easily take that and who desperately want to attack Iran, right? And other people and your fans and people that are reading you, that are watching, etc., can think, well, yeah, these guys they all want to commit suicide, they all want to go to heaven. We got to hit them. We got to hit them.
I'm not saying we're in that situation, right? So so again, we have to and you have to follow every word in this argument. There's a difference between long-range nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons, right? Long-range means you can launch a missile from wherever you are and hit Paris and London and New York and Los Angeles, right? Even North Korea doesn't have that technology now. Pakistan does not have that technology. So it's not simply a matter of having nuclear weapons. But yes, if we can't have a Cold War with a regime, and I'm not saying Iran is this regime, but I'm saying there's a possible regime, a regime of true jihadists who prove with their actions that they really believe what they say they believe, right?
So we might have even a disagreement on the core of that hypothetical. Let's say ISIS becomes a state of some sort, and we are significantly concerned that they have acquired a nuclear weapon. I would never do a first strike, because you're going to kill hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of innocent people, men, women, and children. I mean, we worried about decapitation. The little babies' heads would explode. Grandmothers' heads would explode. I would never do that.
Okay, but look what we did. Again, you have to just look at history and where we come from. Look at the Second World War. The nuclear bombs we dropped were not even the worst things we did in the Second World War. I mean, the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo arguably killed many more people and in more horrible ways, right? In fact, the argument for using the nukes was that we wouldn't have to do any more firebombing. It would be such a punctate and startling show of power that we would actually save lives, both our own and the Japanese.
Sam, I hope that we have developed into a better, slightly more humane world. I mean, if
But I'm
if
saying
right now we went back to fire bombings, Jesus, we would have regressed so much. If we went back to nuclear weapons, we would have regressed so much. Part of why I believe in America and I love America is for all the reasons that the conservatives miss, which is the Marshall Plan, rebuilding our enemies, promoting human rights, and promoting a culture where we, even though we did those bad things in the past, that we don't nuke people anymore. We don't do those horrible killing of civilians to the best we can. And we have done that in horribly flawed ways. Okay, but that is the path that we set the world on when we were doing the right things.
You and I totally agree that we've made progress and we want to hold on to that progress, right? So yes, these were all war crimes by any standard, right? How we waged war. I mean, we were fighting the Nazis, so we had a real enemy that and a very powerful one, but the way both sides behaved was just it was completely insane by any moral standard in terms of the conscious targeting of civilians by the hundreds of thousands, right? So yes, one would hope we could never do that again, and we want to get to what I want to do is get to a world where a war between the U.S. and Iraq, or a war between the U.S. and China, or just wars, is no more plausible than a war between Vermont and New Hampshire. So we have to find ourselves to a situation of global civil society where things like North Korea, if they are in fact possible anymore, are looked at as a kind of crime problem, a hostage situation that the entire world has to intervene on, and we have to stop genocides when we see them. So but now, the question is how to get there, and a nuclear disarmament is something that we should absolutely attempt. But again, it's a difficult thing to do, given that the technology can't be uninvented, given that no,
I'm not very liberal in that regard. I don't believe disarmament is possible. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think it's possible.
But if you don't believe it's possible, then there is a first strike policy implicit in the having of these weapons.
No, there isn't. Not in it.
Even if your policy is we don't have a first strike policy.
I think there would be a good debate as to whether, let's say, a bad actor in Pakistan got a hold of a nuke and somehow delivered it to the U.S. and killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. I know that every president in the world would go ahead and do a retaliatory strike on Pakistan. I think there should be a good argument that you shouldn't, because it's not the people of Pakistan who did that. It's that bad actor. We should find him and kill the living hell out of him. Okay. So, but as a first strike, no, I would never contemplate that, because then you are doing what you are accusing them of wanting to possibly do.
No, but let's say we had we're back in the Cold War now. It's us and the Soviet Union. And we have intelligence that is just incontrovertible that the Soviet Union is planning a first strike, right? And so just take out the uncertainty, right? We believe this as surely as we believe anything, that they're, on July 4th of this year, of next year, they're gonna wipe out every major city in America, right? For whatever reason. Things have heated up to that degree. Having nukes of your own is the only, you can't conventionally deal with that problem, right? We would have, in that case, execute our own first strike.
Having nukes and using them first are two entirely different things.
But what you're not granting is that one could ever be pushed to the brink of where self-defense became synonymous with using your biggest weapons.
I'm not granting that. And the reason, Sam, is because we don't live in a hypothetical world. We live in a real world where there will always be uncertainty. And in that world where there is uncertainty, I'm afraid that people are going to take what you say as a carte blanche to, well, I thought it was going to happen, so I went ahead and pressed the button.
It's not, but what you're saying is even more dangerous in my view. What you're saying is, we don't have to think about how bad and scary things could get, given that this technology is in place.
No, but I'm not saying that at all.
I'm saying that there are certain people certain cultures, given their beliefs, given their stated beliefs, can't get these bombs.
So that, I think it's a false choice. So what I would suggest is, yes, a war of ideas. Yes, oftentimes war of special forces to get particular bad guys. I think that we did the bin Laden thing almost exactly right. So I would suggest 18 different ways to fight that problem. But I would not have on the table as one of the options, we kill millions of their innocent civilians before they do it to us.
Okay, but all I'm
because
saying
you live in a world of uncertainty. You can never make that assumption because that makes you as bad as them. In fact, it makes you worse because you did it first.
No, because again, self-defense is a different. It goes back to what you said about the Marshall Plan. This is why intentions matter. This is why the kind of world you want to live in matters. So, for instance, we did these horrible things to the Germans in the middle of World War II. We burned people by the tens of thousands alive. Women and children, we burned them alive with firebombing, right? We knew we were doing it. We did it anyway. Somebody thought it was necessary. We can argue about whether or not it was necessary. We can argue about if it would be even possible to fight the Nazis and win by our current ethical standards. I'm not so sure it would have been, right? Which is a problem for our current ethical standards, right? So it's possible to see how the world could roll back to the ethics of World War II, and that would be a terrible thing. But what did we actually want to do with Germany? If we had true power, and in this case we ultimately did because we won the war, what did we want? We wanted sane collaborators. We wanted peaceful, honest people who we could do business with, right? And we wanted the same in Japan, and we helped build up these societies. What does ISIS want? What would ISIS do to America if they could do anything they want? We know what they would do. They're not.
So again,
it's a different aspiration.
But Sam, I'm worried that you're conflating ISIS with Muslims. So
no,
again, because and I'll tell you why. Because when you get into the real world,
it's obviously not all Muslims.
Right.
But
no, I know you're not saying all Muslims, but the reason why I think you're conflating it is because when you turn to the Palestinian issue, right, which you've written about, and you use that same exact way of thinking. You say, well, if the Israelis could do whatever they want to the Palestinians, we know what they would do because they're doing it right now, and we know if the Palestinians had it their way, they would wipe out all of the Jews. That's actually, I don't think that's true at all. I don't think it's remotely true. And I'll tell you.
But you're doing some mind reading, right? So you're in the telepathy business.
Are you.
No. They're telling us that they would wipe out everyone. So
no. So Sam, two things that are important there. Number one, Muslims had all the opportunity.
I'm talking about Hamas in particular.
Right. So, well, okay, then that's a slightly different conversation. But okay, look, Muslims did have all the opportunity in the world to kill all the Jews when they were in charge in the Middle East, and they didn't, right? So it is not necessarily because of Islam. It's the political situation they find themselves in and the frustration. Go on, why is that?
I've explained why they didn't kill all the Jews and all the Christians because of the doctrine of Dimitude.
Okay, then because of that same doctrine, why the Palestinians wouldn't kill all the Jews?
Again, I'm talking about Hamas, the democratically elected government in Gaza, right? So there are many Palestinians who agree with Hamas, clearly. Hamas, the state in the charter of Hamas, genocide is explicit, right?
But Sam,
and we know
saying if you ask the Irish terrorist, no, I'm going to tell you why. Look, if you ask an Irish terrorist in the middle of the Northern Ireland fight, would you kill them all? He would say, yes, I would. Yes, I would. I'd kill them all.
That's purely plucked out of your imagination.
No, but Sam, everybody fighting under those circumstances says, I'm going to kill them all. But when the Muslims were in charge, they didn't kill them all. And by the way, so now we get to, again, the core of the issue, which is that you say if the Israelis could do anything they want, well, they wouldn't do better. Well, wait a minute. Now, they can do anything they want, and they occupy them, right? And so... and they prevent a state from happening. Then you turn around and you say, well, the Palestinians are really bad because if they could do anything they want, they would prevent Israel from being a state. But that's theoretical. What Israel's doing is real. They are already preventing the Palestinians from having a state.
When people tell you that they want to commit a genocide, when they tell you publicly and they say it to themselves in private, you should take them seriously because we know people are capable of genocide.
Sam, then we go back to the earlier conversation.
But take that on board. You're really going to dispute that?
Is when Hitler says, I did it for Christianity, is it really true? Well, it's half true, half not true. He did it for a confluence of factors. And when somebody says, I'm doing it for a certain reason, do you believe them completely? Of course not. It depends on what are their factors. It's the neuroscience question we tackled earlier. Why are they saying that? Are they saying that because they want to seem like they have bravado and they're? I mean,
Let me just say a little bit more about this because we know we have a wealth of information with respect to what groups like Hamas and what even the Palestinians more generally say to themselves, when they're talking just to themselves about the Jews, when they're creating children's programs for their kids about the Jews, right? And genocide runs straight through it. right? So the aspirations of...
You really don't believe that there's an enormous geopolitical reason behind that? The occupation, the crushing existence of the occupation is what's leading to that horrible ideology?
It's not, no, it's not. But what occupation led to the genocidal intentions of the Nazis?
No, so there could be two different reasons. Actually, there could be many different reasons why you go to genocidal intentions. So, if you had asked people living under occupation, the Tamil Tigers, you name it, right? You want to kill them all? My guess is a great, or not a majority, but a lot of them would say, hell yeah, I want to kill them all, right? And sometimes it's the reverse, where you have complete power and you can do whatever you want to people, and that leads to horrible results. But in all of those cases, it's not the religion alone that determines it. Religion is a factor, and I would say in the case of the Palestinians, a small factor. That in fact, if they had the power, my guess is as human beings, they would react very similar to the Jews and the Israelis, not in the good and the bad. I don't think they'd kill all the Jews, because you have to flip the situation completely, the context completely. On the other hand, would they also subjugate and occupy the Jews? I bet they would, because they're human beings, and that's apparently how human beings react.
Okay, well, I think, again, we're talking about the weighting of various factors, because of course the occupation is a factor, right? Now, the occupation is not a factor that explains most of the other instances of suicidal violence and theocratic violence we see in the Muslim world. The occupation of the Palestinian territories has nothing to do with the reasons why a Sunni in Pakistan is going to wake up tomorrow morning and sacrifice his life to kill a Shia wedding party.
Yeah, no, right? Sam, I believe that we are way underestimating, and many people disagree with me, and you're of course free to disagree with me, but I think we are way underestimating the impact of the occupation for the whole Muslim world. That it is driving
Sunni,
the Pakistanis
Sunni,
to be more
Ahmadi,
fundamentalist. No, but what's interesting and perhaps ironic is that it might be driving the Sunni and the Shia to be more fundamentalist. And in that fundamentalism, they then fight each other, which is not the only reason why they fight each other, but it makes that fight worse.
But again, fundamentalism is only a problem if the fundamentals are a problem, right? So fundamentalist Jainism is nobody's problem.
I know, but the fundamentals of Christianity is wrong, the fundamentals of Judaism is wrong. The reason they are not doing that at this particular time is because of the geopolitical circumstances they find themselves in. But look at America. We don't have suicide bombers. Why? We don't need them. We got F-1s. We got
Christian fundamentalists.
Submarines. We got aircraft carriers.
We have Christian fundamentalists by the tens of millions in America. They have great socioeconomic conditions by comparison. Yep. They're waiting for the rapture. They're as crazy as all get out on specific issues. They will impede life-saving medical research based on crazy ideas. They will, in certain circumstances, I've granted you, their beliefs are, when you add nuclear weapons to them, as terrifying as you could want. I mean, if we had enough things happening in the world that seemed to be a confirmation of prophecy, who knows what an evangelical president could be capable of, right?
All terrifying. Number one danger in the world, by the way.
So and this is what was so egregious about your titling that video of me, is Sam Harris is more dangerous than Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin in the White House was a truly terrifying circumstance. And I did more than most people to shine a light on what was scary about that circumstance. You know, I published articles just unpacking just how...
based on C.J. Werleman's points there, which we changed the title on that because I thought you were generally right about it. But at the same time, his point was, look, if you believe in a first strike and you think that he's not nuanced enough in that position, we already had that conversation, then maybe you could be as dangerous as Sarah Palin he thinks.
It's not that I believe in a first strike. I believe that we are meandering into a circumstance where even with the best of intentions, good people could see no alternative but to commit a horrendous crime, as good people have done again and again in the history of war with the technology available. Good people committed horrendous crimes throughout World War II based on a pure perception of self-defense, right? And a logical one given what the enemy was doing to them. The bombing of London gave the British every reason to bomb Dresden, right? So it's not, again, what's so horrible and what we have to grapple with is that bad ideas and bad circumstances and bad incentives can allow for good people to behave like absolute monsters. That's much scarier than the few monsters in the world. It's much scarier than the 1% of psychopaths. To have ideas, to have systems, to have incentives where people who are better than you and me can be committed to atrocities. And so again, a belief in paradise is one of the scarier memes to have running on the hard drive, because
Sam,
it changes the equation on so many fronts.
So we agree completely on the ideology. So let me see if I can reach a conclusion here, right? So I would argue that the liberal policies, progressive policies, would be a better way of getting the Muslim world away from those dangerous ideologies than some of the ideas that certainly conservatives put forward, and I would argue that you put forward, right? But you tell me if you're not putting it forward.
What do I put forward?
I agree with you on the war of ideas. I don't know whether you call that liberal or not, right? But when you talk about possibly torturing, possibly nuking, possibly bombing, the continuing the occupation, et cetera, et cetera. Hold on, let me just finish, and then I'll, of course, you'll address it, right? When you talk about those things, I fear that that is a militaristic approach that does not make the situation better, that in fact is counterproductive, that it creates an us versus them that drives the Muslim world more towards fundamentalism, and we get further away from our mutual goal.
Okay, well, the fear of driving the Muslim world more toward fundamentalism is a rational one, and it is also kind of dispiriting one, because what it's saying is that there's a real fear that most Muslims, or a sufficient number of Muslims, can't recognize how abhorrent ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab are, and can't see that when we are fighting these guys and doing our best to intervene in these situations, we're the good guys, right? So that's the fear, right? So the fear is if we just go into Syria right now and Iraq and just kill ISIS, that is so inflammatory to so many Muslims who can't see straight that we're going to create more radicalism. Okay, that's a legitimate fear. It says something terrible about what's happening in the Muslim world and about the influence of religion.
It might say something terrible about
let me finish, because you put a lot on the table.
Yeah, sorry.
No, not imperialism. It's not imperialistic to go deal with ISIS. ISIS
the imperialism we've done in the past, that makes them skeptical, very naturally and obviously and fairly skeptical of our intentions today.
Okay, but let's spell out our intentions ad nauseum. Let's convene a summit of all the heads of whatever, the greatest mosques we can get on board, and let's just spell it out. ISIS guys, there's a real problem. Should we deal with them, right? Now, it's still a rational concern that having infidels go into former Muslim lands and deal with people who claim to have started a caliphate, that's going to be so inflammatory that it's going to push many more people in the direction of radicalism. It's a reasonable concern. It says something bad about Islam, and it says something bad about the state of our world.
Bad about us.
It doesn't say anything bad about us. It said because
but Sam, it says two bad things about us. One, we think that the correct option in how to deal with the Muslim world is a military option.
Okay, let's be agnostic about that. But there are certain cases in which the only way to intrude is militarily. I would argue ISIS is one of them. Now, I actually think I'm beaten down enough by reality at this point as to think that, we actually can't really go in and save the Yazidis. We have to wait for the Muslims in the neighborhood to do it. It's so inflammatory to have Christian crusaders doing this that we need the Turks and the...
I don't even think it's the Christian crusaders. I think that what people are skeptical about is you're going to come take our oil.
We just want the oil, right? We couldn't buy this, but it's much more cost effective to spend trillions of dollars.
They have a fair point there. It's not about us, the American people, getting the oil. It's about the oil contracts, and we are often driven by that because of donations to the political system.
Yeah, I think so. I don't believe most of that, but in any case, I understand the perception is there, and we have to deal with the perception. The perception is harmful, and the conspiracy theories that run through the Muslim world are harmful, and the conspiracy theories that run through our world are harmful, in that it's almost impossible for good people to use power in a way that is not causing more of a problem, because everyone distrusts power. Everyone has a story about why the people in power are always evil.
So right? Sam, again, look, two things about that. One, it's not a conspiracy theory. Halliburton's stock price went up fivefold during the Iraq War. They gave $34 million to Dick Cheney as an exit
theory
bonus.
that we would have gone to war purely to drive up Halliburton's stock price.
Not purely, but it would also be naive to think that that was not a factor, right? That the guy who got $34 million, I mean, you always talk about, just look at the plain face of it, right? Look at the plain face of it. A guy gets $34 million and he starts a war which his former company profits fivefold from.
There are people who think that we demoed the World Trade Center
that's crazy
in order to do all of that.
No,
right? So
no,
like,
that's
how
crazy
crazy
talk,
do you
but
want to
Sam,
get?
but again, there are a number of factors as to why we go into countries. So when you say to Muslims, we're the good guys and we're coming to bomb you because we're the good guys and we're trying to help you, you have to see that there is very healthy skepticism about that.
But it's not healthy when it's true that we're actually the good guys. Forget about us.
But they can discern that because they didn't hate us for Bosnia, they didn't hate us for Kosovo. Now you think we didn't get enough credit for that, but they did like those actions. If you ask Muslims across the world, they will say America did the right thing there. Right. So they actually did a correct assessment.
Thing, we were not.
They did a correct assessment of Bosnia, and they did a fairly correct assessment of our intentions in Iraq.
Well, yeah, it's not. I think it's a scary situation when we could not, for the best of intentions, try to stop a genocide without creating more of a problem that's going to give us future genocides. That's a scary status quo, which we have to fix. And a war of ideas is going to be the way to change that ultimately.
Yeah.
And you know, so you mentioned special forces. I think yes, what we did, even though that was totally inflammatory with respect to Pakistan's view of us and their willingness to collaborate with us, so it was arguably harmful there. But one could wonder why we have to own any of this. Why couldn't all of this stuff be covert? You know, we deal with ISIS in a way that no one announces, right? Why does Obama have to say we're now going to deal with ISIS? Well, let's just deal with ISIS. That would be another way of doing it, and it might not necessarily create the same liabilities.
We're going to go to the Middle East and say we're the good guys, trust us. We have to earn that trust.
And I don't just mean we Americans. I mean the civilized world. You know, 50 countries.
America, the West, Israel, however you want to characterize it. But when we go to Iran and say let's do honest negotiations, but meanwhile I'm going to assassinate your nuclear scientists, and some of those scientists who aren't even working on the nuclear program, but I'm going to assassinate them in front of their kids' kindergarten. Well, then they go, well, I'm not sure you are the good guys, right? And when we say, hey, you know what, we're the good guys, but we're going to keep occupying Palestine indefinitely, pretty much, right? So, but trust us, we're the good guys. Can you see why they don't trust us?
Well, yeah, of course. And I'm not denying that we are trailing a very unfortunate history of foreign policy disasters and cynicism and propping up dictators who were terrible dictators, who were not benevolent dictators, right? Evil dictators. And we propped up Saddam Hussein against the Iranians. I mean, so it's yes, but you have to, you roll back the clock enough on anybody and you just get sheer barbarism, right? So we're all trailing this past of just everyone was the bad guy at some point, right? But the question is, how do if you start the clock running now with current intentions, right? And current intentions that are very different. I mean, when you ask, even somebody like George Bush, who I thought was a disaster and a terrifying ignoramus in many ways, if you ask what would he have done, what would he have done with Iraq if he could have just done anything he wanted, right? He'd just go in there, change the government. Is he going to just start letting American troops rape and kill and pillage? And no, he would have made Iraq like Nebraska, right? He would have that in terms of what he wanted to happen there. He wants a democracy that we can collaborate with. He wants the oil at a fair price, or let's say he wants to steal the oil, right? But he does. He wants.
It's not quite as simple.
He
as
wants.
steal the oil,
He
right.
wants things. He wants things to run, in a benign way. He's not. He was not Genghis Khan, right?
He wouldn't have taken Iraq for our purposes, but he would have handed every relevant part of the wealth to the multinational corporations.
But still, he also. But any sane person, no matter how cynical, who wants Halliburton to succeed, still wants a quality of life in Iraq that is a hell of a lot better than the current quality of life in Iraq, right? We want a secular, tolerant, open society in Iraq.
So because we deposed, so in that case we get rid of a bad guy, a dictator, Saddam Hussein in Iraq. But in Iran, we got rid of a good guy, who was in 1953 was a democratically elected leader of Iran, and we deposed them for the same reason we deposed the bad guy, which is our companies wanted those oil contracts, and the British companies as well. And that's an acknowledged fact, but it's not a conspiracy theory. The United States government says, yes, we did that coup, and we did it. Why? Because the companies wanted the Iranian oil at a cheap price. Not us, not the citizens, but the companies did. So, no, both Bush and at the time Eisenhower,
we've made a ton of moral progress.
I guess they wouldn't mind a nice Iran and Iraq that has economic progress, but that's not really the point. The point is, in both of those situations, we get the resources. So that's why they don't trust us, because they're right not to trust us.
I'm not conceding that was entirely a war over resources, but I think we've just spoke about this before. We have made a lot of moral progress since 1950, since 1940, since 1930. I mean, we were lynching black people in 1940 and into the 60s, but I mean, if you look at the 20s and 30s, I mean, it's just the kind of behavior you saw, especially in the South, but I mean, it's just unthinkable today. It's right out of the worst parts of the Middle East.
And that is why Iraq was so outrageous, because it seemed like we had gone backwards to those days, right? Where we were doing coups, where we were attacking countries that didn't attack us. Iraq didn't attack us. So that's why it seemed to many people, justifiably so, including the Muslim world, here come these guys again, and therefore they're here for our resources, our oil, whatever it happens to be. Okay. So my point, in trying to reach a conclusion is, if we were to do it the right ways, so war of ideas. So look, I've said things that are both a little tongue-in-cheek and somewhat true, is that I would rather bomb them, first of all, with books. I'm totally serious about that. And secondly, with porn. In the Muslim world, if you have access to the internet, you are far more likely, and that's another Pew Research poll, far more likely to be positive towards the West, Western culture, and to Christianity, okay? So give them the internet, give them our culture, do the culture wars, and I don't mean hostile. I mean, hey, isn't this a better way of life? What do you need the 72 virgins in heaven for? I got 72 girls in Vegas that are better, right? So yes, fight that war, but at the same time, earn their trust. Don't say, I'm the good guy, and I'm going to prove it to you by occupying your country or bombing your country or doing a military solution. I'm the good guy because I ended the occupation.
Okay, but you seem to think I'm much more hawkish than I am. I think you and I probably, on the checklist of interventions, you and I might check the same boxes. I mean, if you're going to check Afghanistan and you're going to check targeted covert operations against the really, really bad guys that we can get without too much collateral damage, then we're checking the same boxes, right? I didn't check the Iraq war box.
That's right. You didn't. By the way, people often charge you with that, but I did my research. You did not do that.
It's not true. And on the torture bit, but we don't have to get into it. But the way my argument about torture is mischaracterized is my argument is not about the ethical wisdom of torture. It's a comparison between torture and collateral damage. And if you could ever think of a circumstance where torture prevents collateral damage, then all of it. So we're all open to torture. I mean, we're all open to collateral damage because you have to wage any kind of war, right? Collateral damage just comes with war. But collateral damage is so much worse than most people realize or want to think about. And if you think of a situation in which torture would spare you collateral damage, well, then all of a sudden torture is on the table as something that ethically, and so this you might think I mean, maybe we're out of time, but my conversation about torture is not just let's just start torturing people because it works and we should do it and who cares about its effects. It's collateral damage is so horrible, and however you align it with torture, it's worse. Which is worse, waterboarding somebody or blowing them up? But
it's a false choice again, Sam.
It's not a false choice. There are situations where
first of all, there's two things that happen out of that. One, you give the Cheneys of the world permission to use torture. They go, look, reasonable guys who call themselves liberal like Sam Harris, who are very secular, telling me that torture is right under some circumstances. I got Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Of course I'm going to torture him. I got the worst of the worst, as they said in Guantanamo. They would have certainly used your ideas to say, obviously we should torture the guys in Guantanamo.
Okay, well, again, there are situations in which that would be clearly unethical and horrible and a war crime. I think torture should be illegal across the board, but illegal is not the same thing as always unethical. You know, if you're out.
So should they have tortured some of the guys in Guantanamo?
if by torture you mean deliberately make someone uncomfortable so that they tell you what they know, someone like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, yeah, I think so. I think that we have no responsibility to make sure Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is comfortable and not inclined to tell us anything.
But you're playing with words there, uncomfortable.
But what is torture?
Torture is torture.
Torture is not always torture.
So waterboarding. Waterboarding has always been torture. And we smash their heads into the walls, by the way. We've left them in freezing cold weather. And by the way, sometimes at Bagram Air Base and other places in Iraq, they died because we left them in freezing cold areas, or we punched them and kicked them so much that they had internal bleeding and they died. That's torture. Torture is torture. So
I see that we have to talk about this. If you can't, this is, again, my argument about torture has several strands to it, but the core fact is that if you can't imagine a situation in which you would make someone uncomfortable so as to try to get information that you knew they had. There are situations where you know someone has information, right? Now, not every situation is like that, but you have to grant that there are situations where you know you're talking to the guilty guy, right? He might even claim to be the guilty guy. He claims he's got the information. He claims he's got a bomb that's going to go off, right? There are situations like this, and sometimes they're small situations that have nothing to do with the war on terror or I mean, they're just crime situations where someone has got somebody locked in a box somewhere, right? And he's not talking, right? If you can't imagine a situation where you would beat someone up so as to get them to talk, you're not thinking hard enough about the kind of evil people confront in this world.
No, Sam. Again, that's a hypothetical. That's not attached.
That has happened.
No, it's not attached to the real world, and I'll tell you why.
It is. Okay. There are instances where it's happened.
So you are saying that you would sometimes. Now you say make them uncomfortable. Come on, that's a euphemism, right? So you would take extreme measures.
It's not just a euphemism. So if torture to some of these guys is telling them that you just smeared menstrual blood on them, or that you dunked a Quran in menstrual blood, right? Or that you'll make them eat bacon.
But that's not, Sam, that's not only what we did. We also threatened to kill them.
Most of what we did, okay, so if you're going to look at Abu Ghraib, that's pure horror, just sadistic horror, right?
Because once you start,
No, it's not.
That's why you've got to avoid those beginnings to avoid those endings. Torture never ends, Sam. In the history of torture, they never started little and remained little. It always starts a little bit, and then they're drawing and quartering people.
You are ignoring half of my argument, which is collateral damage is so much worse than torture, and we have all accepted it.
So let me address that. So that's why I talk about what happened in reality. So, for example, when we tortured the guys, I believe it was al-Libi that we brought over to Egypt to torture, right? And he finally confessed when we said we were going to bury him alive. And we literally buried or dug up a ditch, or we had the Egyptians do it, right? And then we started burying him there. And then he said, okay, you got it. Iraq was connected to Al-Qaeda. Now, it turns out he was lying.
This is a different conversation.
But
that's bad information.
It's the heart of this conversation, Sam. Because if you torture people, they will tell you not what the reality is, but what they think you want to hear. And it was obvious to al-Libi, and he was right, that what we wanted to hear was, okay, Iraq did it, even though he knew it was false.
All right. Well, I don't. The details of that story, I don't know how well vetted that is, but I'll just accept that as true. But it is another politically correct myth that torture never works, and that people can just make stuff up out of whole cloth that then leads you on a wild goose chase to harm other people. There are certainly circumstances where that can happen, but you just have to imagine how these real world circumstances come about. You capture someone in Al-Qaeda along with his laptop, his hard drive. You have all, 10 years worth of emails, right? So you have a lot of information, and people, these people who are interrogating them, you can't just make stuff up, right? There's a ton of information here, and again, I'm not sanguine about the torture being a benign thing that we should do cavalierly. I think it should be illegal. I think if somebody does it in a circumstance that isn't in absolute extremity of where any decent person would be tempted to use force in this circumstance, then these people should be prosecuted and go to jail for decades, right? But there are circumstances where you would have to be a monster not to lay hands on the bad guy.
Sam,
you're not you're just not imagining those circumstances.
No. So let me clarify, because this is important, right? So I'm not saying that torture has never worked and will never work under any circumstance. What I am saying is that, number one, it is unlikely to work. Not that it never works, that it is unlikely to work, and I'll tell you why in a second. And that, number two, it has such terrible consequences, both in terms of what we are doing to our captors and what we are doing to our own morality, and the message we're sending to the rest of the world about whether we're good guys or bad guys, that I wouldn't do it. I might not do it even if I thought that it was absolutely going to work. And I don't think it is. It's very unlikely. Why is it unlikely to work? We waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed 183 times. If it worked, why do we have to do it 183 times? It doesn't work. Okay. By 182 times, we should have gotten the sense it's not working.
We're not going to resolve this conversation here. I should say that my position on torture is exactly the position on torture that you find in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, right? And one thing that's happening to me now in conversations like this and on many topics is that much of my discussions have not to do with policy, but have been an effort to get at ethical bedrock. I mean, I write and think as a philosopher, and in the context of having a philosophical discussion about ethics and right and wrong, you can say many things that seem crazy outside of a philosophy seminar, but in a philosophy seminar are totally legitimate. So in a philosophy seminar, you could say, why can't we eat babies? What's wrong with eating babies? If we've got extra babies around that nobody wants, why can't we eat them, right? That is a completely insane thing to say in the world, seemingly. That's the kind of thing that if quoted out of context, if Glenn Greenwald decides to tweet, Sam Harris can't figure out why we can't eat babies, right? It makes me look like an asshole. But the reality is that if you're talking about, if you're trying to get to the bedrock about the ethics of good and evil and the use of force, if you're trying to just, then starting the conversation with why can't we eat babies? Give me an ethical argument about why this is really, really wrong, why our intuitions of its wrongness can be conserved. That is a totally legitimate thing to do, and there's not a philosopher on earth who would think you were a weirdo for having that conversation. So much of my discussion, I don't tend to write down to my readers, and much of my discussion of things like nuclear deterrence and torture and all of these very inflammatory issues, the biggest one is the link between belief and action, killing people for their beliefs, right? Those are had in the context of a very extensive conversation in philosophical terms about how do we get to ethical bedrock. What makes it right to kill Osama bin Laden? How is it right? Is it right by virtue of all the people he's killed? Well, no, because we're not even sure he personally killed anyone, right? Is it right by virtue of all the people that Al-Qaeda killed already? Well, why? Because killing Osama bin Laden doesn't bring them back to life. It doesn't help anybody who's already been killed. It doesn't help their families. No, it makes sense based on what he's aspiring to do in the future. All the people we're going to hopefully prevent from being killed. So when you get to the bottom of that, as I was doing in this discussion about the link between belief and behavior, I am saying that in that case, you really are bombing his beliefs, right? It's the fact that you are sure he believes what he says he believes, and that those beliefs are going to lead to action, right? You're not bombing beliefs that aren't going to lead to action. It's the measure of the strength of the belief that connects it to action. It's an extensive conversation about the nature of belief and what beliefs are as programs of action, and I can defend every part of that argument, but it's hard to defend it when someone says, oh, you're just trying to kill people for thought crimes. No, I'm trying to get to an ethical justification for why it was okay to kill Osama bin Laden if we couldn't capture him. I'm not even someone who thinks he should have been killed. I think he should have been captured. But if we couldn't capture him, killing him made sense not as retribution, as many people think. The logic of retribution makes absolutely no ethical sense to me. But it makes sense to prevent further harm. And when you look at the micro details of how you think you're preventing further harm, you were talking about what he believed and what he was going to do on the basis of his beliefs. And again, I'm paying a massive penalty for trying to have a fine-grained, intelligent, and quasi-academic discussion, and it's getting exported onto Twitter and into the minds of people like Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan, who don't want to engage with my argument closely enough to understand it, or they're quite happy to cynically mislead people as to what I'm actually saying. And I think it's in their case, I think it's the latter. But there are many people who are just confused by the norms of philosophical, ethical discourse, and they just don't say, well, how could you even be talking about eating babies? You monster, right?
Right.
These people don't know what it's like to be in a philosophy seminar, and that is largely the problem we're dealing with here. And it's made especially excruciating because many of these conversations abut public policy, right? So when you're talking about the ethics of torture, you're having that conversation in a world where there are people like Dick Cheney who are trying to figure out, whether we can have a policy of rendition, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's a good point to end on, because I think that is your central defense, and you've laid it out, and I hope that we had enough of a conversation here where people got a sense of where you stand on the issues and the context with which you put the issues. Now, I know, I agree. With Reza, I have significant disagreements. With Glenn, I don't have that many disagreements, and I think that he would say the problem with what you just stated is that you're not in a philosophy seminar, that we're in a world where people are influenced by your ideas, and that I shouldn't put words in Glenn's mouth. I'm worried that it's going to have ramifications and consequences.
Absolutely, and I'm not denying, I'm not saying that this is just an ivory tower exercise that has no consequences. I want good ideas to have consequences, and I think torture should be illegal. I'm just saying that we have accepted collateral damage that is so much more horrible than anyone realizes or wants to realize. And there are situations where there is a trade-off between making Khalid Sheikh Mohammed uncomfortable, waterboarding him, and blowing up a dozen people who happen to be standing near the bad guy. And it's worse to blow up those dozen people, and no one is reacting like that. Not even Glenn Greenwald, with his finely tuned fear of causing harm abroad, is reacting like collateral damage is as bad as it is. To even talk about the prospect of waterboarding Khalid Sheikh Mohammed gets you vilified so that you're not taken seriously on any other point, and yet the New York Times can report instances of collateral damage that, if you look at the details, are the most shocking things imaginable. Little girls getting their arms blown off, and yet it just goes past everyone's head, right?
Sam, I think that they definitely take you seriously. So, for better or for worse, they are addressing your points so, significantly because they believe that a lot of people believe what you believe.
With goodwill, trying to actually understand your opponent's position.
Right. But they certainly think that you have an effect in the world, and that's why they're addressing it. So, that is what it is. I really, really hope that this was a good opportunity to have the conversation and to give context to all of the different things that we discussed. So thank you so much for coming in, Sam. Really appreciate it. Yep. And by the way, the new book is really interesting and a whole different topic.
And there's no torture in the new book.
Right, waking up, and it again a point where we totally agree, right? And it's a fascinating conversation about spirituality and the connection to science and how it does not have to be connected to religion. So I recommend that.
Cool.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you.